Now, a disclaimer for this video. As you guys should remember, back in summer, World of Warcraft had its big classic release. At the time, I played it, a good amount of it, and it inspired me to make a review. I wanted to compare WoW Classic to Guild Wars 1. They were both games that came out at a very similar period of time. Their studios have these connected histories. I thought it would be a great exercise. The thing is, as the year went along and I continued writing this script, it got bigger and bigger, became a really intense production, and then I stopped playing WoW. Yeah, I ran dry with it. Some other stuff came out around that time, and I put the game to the side, telling myself I would return and then I'd pick the review up again. But it's been months now. I really don't know whether I will ever get back to it. So I have hours of research and scripting done. This enormous, gargantuan product that is unlikely to ever be truly completed. In particular, I have the problem that Blizzard is releasing new phases of the game as they add stuff like the honor system, some of the really deeper end game I never got into, and I really have no intention of going to do them. Those elements aren't included in this review, and it's incomplete for that reason, if not anything else. The later phases of the script aren't finished either. So basically, a bunch of the arenas for comparison are only there in bullet point form, and I never went back to do a review pass, make the thing less waffly and a bit more concise, so it definitely can meander a bit. But my enthusiasm for the whole thing is bottomed out. However, instead of just leaving it and throwing away all the efforts I put in, I thought I would cobble together what the review is in some kind of Frankenstein production and give you guys what I think is still a really, really good selection of observations and opinions about these two very interesting, very complex products. Hope you guys enjoy, and the filler footage I'll end up throwing in the background now, and let's see what we think.
4 years have passed since the mortal races banded together and stood united against the might of the Burning Legion.
When I was a young girl, my father fought in the Guild Wars. He gave up his life, keeping our home safe. The days of peace are over.
Introduction. The year is 2004, and in November, right before Christmas, Blizzard released their soon-to-be blockbuster MMO, World of Warcraft. Blizzard haven't made an MMO before, but they know them well, and they're pretty confident they can take existing MMO concepts, not rock the boat too much, and deliver them in such a polished and high-budget way that their game will be a success. The product's set. It's based on a prominent and well-known existing Blizzard IP that just had a major release, Warcraft 3, only 1 year prior, and is built by a recognizable, successful studio that has also recently hit it big with both the original StarCraft and the epic Diablo 2. Only 4 months later, in early 2005, an unheard-of studio called ArenaNet, founded by a selection of ex-Blizzard devs and with no prior releases of their own, go gold on their own game. They know MMOs too, but believe in a different form of massively multiplayer experience. Their game is called Guild Wars, later to be renamed Guild Wars Prophecies, and it's looking to go in new and untested directions with the genre. Before we even get into the games, it's pretty obvious from the state of the board how things would go. World of Warcraft had the perfect setup. It was destined to be huge. Everyone knew about it, and I would say it became the ultimate gaming phenomenon of the West for a good time through the mid and end of the 2000s. Guild Wars, meanwhile, well, most people never knew about Guild Wars. It was nearly a decade later, when Guild Wars 2 was becoming a big deal, that many people even considered that there was an original, and they had the opportunity to play it. No, ArenaNet had a hell of a battle to fight if they legitimately wanted to dethrone Blizzard, and I think it's pretty clear they weren't able to. Guild Wars 1 launched strong, but then largely remained on the fringe for many years, with its new campaign additions generating less and less buzz, while Blizzard and World of Warcraft just went from strength to strength. If subscription counts, or revenue garnered, or number of references in outside media, or size of Wikipedia page or Google Trends, or most anything else are your main consideration, there's likely no discussion to have. World of Warcraft is clearly the bigger game. But what was the better game? When we strip away the fact that one of these products clearly had a massive leg up, when we look purely at what the MMOs themselves had to offer, which was really doing things smarter and being more entertaining, which had the better grip on the way that gaming was going? I'm a Guild Wars player. I was lured to the franchise for its simple buy-to-play, zero microtransactions, zero subscription fee model that was one of the most unique and alluring features of the original game that no one else, certainly not Blizzard, was really doing. They all charged a subscription fee. And that was a powerful thing. But that's it. That's why I was playing. Again, it wasn't about the games. I, and I'm sure many others, never really had an opportunity to genuinely compare the two experiences because our parents simply wouldn't countenance paying a sub fee for a video game in the first place. And I had always wondered, what was World of Warcraft really like? Would I have more fun there? And make no mistake, the two products were keenly aware of one another, not just because ArenaNet was founded by some ex-Diablo devs. The number of skill names, locations, NPC names, and so on which appear in both fantasy worlds is something that has truly astonished me. In many ways, these products were gunning for one another. So comes the ultimate question. Which was more feature-rich? Which had more content? Which had better combat? Which was more immersive? Whose philosophies were better founded? Was Blizzard's success only because of their epic platform to launch from? Was ArenaNet's success only because they didn't charge a sub fee? Years later, when I'm an adult with access to my own money, I find I can't really answer that question any longer. World of Warcraft had changed too much. Guild Wars wasn't even really being updated any longer as we waited for its sequel, Guild Wars 2, and people were moving on from asking the question at all. But now, something fantastic happened. World of Warcraft Classic. A re-release of the original WoW experience, and I get to explore it as it was for the first time and find my answer. Sure, making a review like this is something like 15 years too late to be relevant to anyone, but when did I ever let that bitch context stop me? So first, let's establish what we're doing. Are we comparing 2019's World of Warcraft Classic to 2019's Guild Wars Prophecies? As though one of you guys watching this video is seriously considering playing one game or the other and looking for a review still? Are we using 2019 WoW Classic to guess at what 2005 WoW was like and comparing it to our admittedly fading memories of 2005 Prophecies? Are we picking an exact moment in time, such as the summer of 2005, when both games were out and both games were relatively new, and guessing at only what the games were like then, or whatever else? Somewhat sadly, there is no Guild Wars Classic initiative in 2019 for me to sink into and make a truly clinical comparison, but maybe going that far isn't as necessary as it has been for WoW, which became radically different over the years and, let's face it, would go on to comprehensively undermine its opening approach. Guild Wars Prophecies, as can be played today in 2019, is not so radically different from its final patch years ago. Once ArenaNet got Guild Wars 2 out the door, they almost completely ignored updating their original game. Guild Wars 1 has been preserved in a sort of cryo sleep for basically a decade now. Playable, it's a live game with a community, but unchanging. Certainly, there are some things different. Guild Wars has hard mode now, which it did not originally. Well, we can ignore hard mode. It's had some graphical updates. Well, those can be toggled off. It has some new late game quests and some content from Guild Wars Beyond. Those can simply not be played. But largely, the mechanics, the world, the leveling rate, the combat pace, they're the same. This review can happen. The only two big differences are first going to be balance, as in Guild Wars 1, all monsters use player skills, and every balance update that ever came changed how the open world functioned in some way, large or small. And secondly, the matter of player population, which has certainly diminished. There are complications to acknowledge on the World of Warcraft side also. 2019's WoW Classic is based on the Drums of War 1.12 patch. That's late August 2006. This classic experience is not the 2004 release. It's way later. It has some minor features in there like raid markers, balance updates, quality of life patches and fixes. A few maybe even being controversial, like the reporting for ninja looting, that really wouldn't have been there in 2004. WoW Classic doesn't fully embrace what it proposes to. And then there's the inclusion of stuff like phasing and voice comms, which muddy the water even further. Blizzard have held back on a lot of the post-release content for the release of WoW Classic. That's being dropped in subsequent months. But truthfully, it's this weird hybrid game you and I are playing in 2019, not the original patch, and this is the only experience I can attest to. Funnily, if we're being truly objective, there are some ugly bugs under the stones on Guild Wars 1's first patch too. Launch Prophecies had all kinds of bizarre mechanics, like having to pay for attribute refunds, capturing skills from living bosses by interrupting them, initially hitting max level for doing a single story mission, and so on. These ideas are totally not representative of Guild Wars 1 as a game or its deeper philosophies. But if we're looking at original patches, they were there. This is so old, I personally wasn't even playing the title that early. I joined a bit later. So let's not talk about these products' first patches, or try to suppose what it was really like when Guild Wars stepped up to the table in April 2005. Maybe it's not a story it will ever be my place to tell. So what about final patches? Interestingly, ArenaNet waited way less time, exactly 12 months, to hit their, so to speak, final patch of Prophecies before churning out their next product. That was Guild Wars Factions, a campaign addition to the game, but not a part of Prophecies. 1 year down the line, and we already have an entirely new continent and game to play with as a Guild Wars player. And that's because ArenaNet's subscription fee-free business model and anti-grind philosophies demanded it. They had to sell new boxes. In just 12 months, ArenaNet had stopped expanding and adding to the original content almost entirely. While Blizzard kept going for a multi-year period from 2004 till 2007 before doing a new box. So a final patch to final patch comparison leaves Guild Wars Prophecy just a few months of updates and Blizzard a few years. So what about, as I mentioned, picking a fixed point in time, such as right before Burning Crusade for Blizzard versus whatever ArenaNet had done in the meantime? Well, that would be World of Warcraft Classic versus Guild Wars Prophecies from 2005, Guild Wars Factions from April 2006, and Guild Wars Nightfall from Halloween 2006, all of which included full games, continents, campaigns, and were released and playable before WoW even got a single expansion. And this was so-called entirely that classic era? Is that fair? Are we meant to sum up the money a Guild Wars 1 player spent on 3 campaigns versus the money a World of Warcraft subscriber spent on their box and a sub fee for 3 years? You could do it, but for me, and this video, that's too far. Even though the Drums of War patch for WoW came out right around the same time as Guild Wars' third full campaign, I only really want to compare these worlds as they initially dropped. So that's what I'm going to try and do. This will be a mess. This will likely be biased. But I'm going for Guild Wars 2005 versus WoW 2005, using 2019's Classic as a baseline and 2019's Playable Prophecies as another rough baseline, some things eliminated. If you have an idea for another review, be my guest. I would love to see it. CORPG? One big subject I feel I have to address out of the gate is whether Guild Wars 1 was even an MMO. Why do this review? I hear the die-hard Guild Wars 1 fans screaming. It's not an MMO, it's a CORPG. That was the name ArenaNet ultimately branded Guild Wars 1, yes, and it's definitely important to point out that Guild Wars 1 did so many things different to other MMOs and stood so starkly against the rest of the grain, it could legitimately be defined as its own genre. But it's also true that leading into Prophecies, ArenaNet did market Guild Wars 1 as an MMO. They only changed this branding later. To this day, you can scroll back to early news posted on the original Guild Wars 1 website, which is still up and being hosted, and you can see them in interviews and press and articles referring to this game as an MMORPG. It's similar enough, and besides, no matter what people call these products, they are vast online worlds that are deeply multiplayer, offering a similar enough experience that people would always ask, which is better? Who cares what label you or ArenaNet later slapped on top? It's still a discussion worth having. Questing and philosophies. Questing's the backbone of nearly any MMO. It's the content you do in most of your formative days. It drives you to explore new places. It gives context to otherwise meaningless grind. It provides new opportunities to earn specific loot and rewards beyond vendors or gambling on RNG drops. It is the single best way for the developers to direct you around and say, hey, go here, do this. And so both games have questing. Questing is not the only thing in these games. There is PvP and guild content and festivals and dungeons and campaign missions and so on, but I do think that quests are a perfect place to start. The differences between the two games are numerous, and it's because the games themselves were founded on different principles and philosophies. For Blizzard and World of Warcraft, it was all about the world of Azeroth, living, being immersed, questing, and being a hero in an authentic, limitless feeling virtual world. That meant crafting a ton of content and not allowing players to run out of things to do at all costs. Blizzard kept the game slow. They weighed you down with mechanics to hinder your pace, like armor repairs, ammunition, potion drinking, death walking, zigzagging back to town to tier up a skill that won't be any functionally different afterwards, but you need to do it to make it stronger. They had an exponentially challenging leveling curve, and Blizzard puts these slowdown mechanics in plain sight, celebrates them, and sells them to you in the name of immersion. When the player inevitably would hit level cap in WoW and become uninterested in the remaining quests or area to explore, Blizzard had to solve that problem with raids, practically pioneering the concept of attunement quests and everything else to consider there. Guild Wars didn't value this stuff so much. For Guild Wars, especially at Prophecies, not so true in later campaigns, questing interior was less about being immersed in a virtual world, though ArenaNet clearly valued this to some extent, as it was about training players for PvP. Raiding wasn't the main endgame, PvP was. PvP, I think ArenaNet reasoned, was more efficient. Create a good PvP game, and you don't have to keep churning out map after map, quest after quest, after dungeon after raid ad infinitum. The game will be dynamic and entertaining and competitive enough to sustain itself with just a few new competitive maps and not much else. And a much smaller, newer studio could deliver this. ArenaNet had seen how big esports were getting as games became more integrated into the internet, correctly predicted how big they might be as the early 2000s marched on, and dreamed of an MMO that could tap into that scene. So, when it came to Tyria, their PvE world, initially they didn't focus on questing or on endgame much at all. In fact, the earliest drafts for Guild Wars, closer to the year 2000 when ArenaNet formed, didn't have a concept of PvE whatsoever. You can see this in a now bizarre-looking old work-in-progress trailer. It's this philosophy that gave the franchise its name, Guild Wars. PvE was decided upon and implemented a bit later in development, but ArenaNet never got around to caring about raids or attunements or dungeons or high level caps. They didn't want or need to slow you down with so-called immersive mechanics or long travel distances. All Tyria wanted to do was make sure you were learning your class's skills and PvP mechanics. Questing and adventuring would unlock more skills. They would encourage you to swap them around and make new builds and see their effects. You would stop leveling at just 20, and all the health bars and combat numbers would stay low and clear in around the double digits. Enemies would hit you about as hard as players would hit you, and not creep much from there. PvE would give you the opportunity to get a secondary profession and learn about other classes you'd be battling in the competitive formats. And even all the enemies in PvE were coded to be using player skills and player balance, so you knew what an enemy mage could nuke you with, or how a necromancer would exploit corpses, even if you yourself were just a ranger/warrior. And then there was the push for you to PvP. People don't really recognize it much, but it's a fact that Guild Wars 1 Prophecies forced players into a PvP arena to fight to the death as a part of the main story right near the beginning of the game. There was no way out or any way to skip. You had to fight someone else or hope the population was low enough there'd be no challenger. It's a system there even to this day. You could never imagine ArenaNet of 2019 doing such a thing, forcing players to PvP, but it's a clear sign of what the original team wanted you to be thinking about going forward. There were competitive arenas for PvP littered all over the PvE world for you to visit. World of Warcraft had a ton of PvP all over its world too, for sure, but in Guild Wars, it was much less about the asymmetric, outnumbered, wild gear chaos that Blizzard had so immersively implemented, and instead, it was designated areas with even team numbers, fair game types, because ArenaNet really was going for that competitive angle. Then, near the end of the original Guild Wars PvE experience, they were sure to give you many missions in a row, introducing all the special game types like Base Assault and Capture the Flag before dumping you at the ultimate PvP battleground of the time, the Tomb of the Primeval Kings, with Guild vs Guild coming after. This was Guild Wars' obsession, not quests, and they were rather thin on the ground. So which game did it better? I think it's really obvious that Blizzard had the bigger incentive and had more content here, magnitudes more. There are race and faction specific quests, class specific quests, dungeon quests, attunement quests, elite difficulty quests. I've read on the wiki that the original design for WoW had just 100 Alliance, 100 Horde, and 100 neutral quests, but they ended up going way over. Well, even if they had just stuck to that initial number, which I don't think they did, then their massive studio still destroyed ArenaNet on quest quantity. Prophecies has, if we're being generous, about 200 quests, a massive number of which you'll never see because they're skill or tutorial quests for professions you aren't playing. The story is that Guild Wars had almost no quests at all done with launch on the horizon, so they hired a single designer to bulk build nearly all of them alone in a rush. Blizzard had that stuff way better delivered. That said, Guild Wars quests, while seriously limited in quantity, did do a lot of things quite well. Unlike in World of Warcraft, Guild Wars quests very rarely ask you to, say, kill 10 rats, an MMO staple. Yeah, there are some, but since Guild Wars instanced its open world maps very differently to World of Warcraft, more on that in a moment, they far more regularly have wave defense quests, specific boss kill quests, escort quests, quests that have you carry environmental objects and interactables, and quests that tangibly change the kinds of patrols or enemies you'd find for the rest of that instance or forever. Enemies don't even respawn in a traditional MMO sense in Guild Wars. They had often very real substance. These things did exist in WoW, but Blizzard, I find, has Azeroth filled with quests that are mostly about RNG loot rolls, kill random quantities of enemy quests, and probably worst of all, quests that are simply asking you to walk to a place, speak to an NPC, and then walk back with no content at all except the fact that walking takes time to do. Guild Wars could never do something so blatantly shallow because they gave you instantaneous travel times to most places you'd already been. You'd have a quest like this where you teleport to one place, click, teleport back, and wonder what the point was. One place that Guild Wars quests arguably do fall short is in terms of rewards. World of Warcraft is so beautifully constructed to make you crazy for gold and crazy for experience that the thrill of turning a quest in is, to me, much stronger than Guild Wars could ever get to. Sure, experience from quests was a big enough thing in Tyria that some people would make profit on selling items like Althea's Ashes, but this sort of stuff was the exception, not the rule. Blizzard put in more work with their gear system too, and when a quest in Azeroth gives me a new item I can actually equip, or a difficult decision of which item to choose from, I'm really enjoying myself. Guild Wars quests never have options like that for rewards, and they're only really interesting if they offer a skill, but most players would just directly buy that skill from a vendor anyway. A similar problem can exist in Azeroth. Dungeons seem to give so much convenient experience in gold that for many they undermine the idea of questing wholesale. A lot of players, especially in the 2019 relaunch, seem so obsessed with optimizing their experience gain that they're not in the open world and they're not participating in this huge facet of the game, which is a shame. Video game players in general tend to not be intelligent enough to recognize the difference between quality experiences and simply rewarding or optimal ones. So if the studio doesn't get the balance right, it's very damaging, and it doesn't seem like Blizzard did to me. It stings me to see them put all these wonderful quests in, and then the players bypass them because they'd be rather running the Scarlet Monastery Cathedral over and over and over. Though maybe in 2004 and 2005, when the information was not around so much, this was not the case. The two games have some interesting differences in how they direct you too. Blizzard implemented all of their quests without specific waypoints. You're being given immersive cardinal directions, like in many old school RPGs, that can lead you lost or in circles for hours even if the quest itself was very simple. It's that same story, slow you down as much as possible and call it immersion. And your quest log is presented as though it were a tangible, physical thing with a real capacity, forcing you to abandon quests, get new ones, beat them, then zigzag all the way back to the original one to collect it again and finally play. Guild Wars, meanwhile, was all business. Unlimited quests in the log with specific waypointed directions to every objective. You just wander forwards and get the thing. I think overall, the gaming community would probably say that ArenaNet did things better on this one, but I personally really appreciate the Blizzard approach, and I'm a sucker for that old school style. Sure, it can be kind of frustrating, and you do have to dedicate brain power to remembering exactly what NPC does what when there's a cluster of them together and none of them are properly marked, but I find I connect with the environment so much more in World of Warcraft than I ever did in the early days of Guild Wars 1. As a sidebar, Blizzard ultimately embraced the notion of their community making add-ons too, and they relied on add-ons from the player base, so to speak, to fix this side of the game. In the end, add-ons essentially make World of Warcraft act just like Guild Wars 1 is out of the box. It's just a bit jankier and less smooth. So maybe this is a lot of conversation about nothing. I think most World of Warcraft players take that extra step to get something like Questy, and don't have much of that experience Blizzard was trying to push on them. I'll note that for the purpose of this review, I have tried to use as few add-ons as possible, just to get a sense of the core of what World of Warcraft is and was. I probably spent my first 150 hours with no add-ons at all, before finally caving and getting a questing add-on, which is still the only one I really use. I know many of you will cry foul that WoW without add-ons is not WoW at all, but considering that Guild Wars and ArenaNet did not encourage add-ons very much, save for abiding by some retexturing tools and user interface skins, I figured this was fair for the comparison. Back to the quests, a place that both games definitely fall down is with story subject material, world building and lore. Don't get me wrong, both settings seem to have fantastic, rich, deep and wide universes, but neither World of Warcraft Classic nor Guild Wars Prophecies did a good job presenting them with their quests. It's the standard fare of an unvoice-acted wall of text 90% of the time. Generic tasks with boilerplate responses and reward dialogues, particularly on the WoW side, with not much intrigue at all. Don't get me wrong, I'm actually fine with not having voice acting, and I tend to think attempting it on a wide scale shackles developers significantly. And maybe it's true that Guild Wars, with so many fewer quests that are of a slightly higher standard, actually does have some pretty good lore in there, but it took me years to appreciate that. My early Guild Wars 1 days were of skipping all quest text and racing to see the next thing, and I'm feeling exactly the same way in Azeroth. I click the NPC, I skim or completely ignore the wall of text, and I take the objective. That's it. We'll talk more about story later. For now, I just wanted to highlight how bad quests are at delivering it in these games. One final note in Azeroth's favour is that of reputation. World of Warcraft included, at release, a whole system that gave you added incentive for completing quests in different regions of the world. You'd be offered discounts upon your upcoming mounts, given different interactions based purely on how much people liked you and how much questing you'd done. Neither game really included a satisfying completed quests or missed quest system for the completionists of us out there, but WoW at least has the reputation system. It's a whole facet the game ArenaNet never bothered with that scores Blizzard big points from me. And that's an experience you'll find a lot of in this review, Blizzard adding a whole thing that ArenaNet never bothered to do. So, all told and considerations in place, which game did it better? I'm going to have to say World of Warcraft. Perhaps beat for beat, Guild Wars did do its individual quests a good bit better. But I think this is simply a case of Blizzard putting a lot of eggs into this basket. It's a big element of their game, and they win with overwhelming force. How can you argue with that number of quests, those kinds of rewards, and things like the reputation system on top? For questing, WoW wins. Immersion. Understand, first of all, that World of Warcraft was going for immersion as one of its big things. Whether you think that's because it was a convenient excuse for adding slow, stalling mechanics, or because they have a real love for it, is up to you. But I must say, I believe it's as much the latter as it's the former, and I adore it. The very way in which Azeroth was coded and presented gives it a leg up on Tyria in this regard. World of Warcraft is a truly open world. It's whole and continuous and with very few loading screens. That's a powerful thing. It means that when you're on an adventure or standing somewhere, you know that in a very real way, off beyond the horizon, are more players and things to see and do. When you look into the sky and see someone riding a bat over a mountain, or a player on a mount running down a road, there's something meaningful there. You know they're real and they're going somewhere real. The value this offers for immersion is immense, and Prophecies has none of it. Prophecies is a bunch of massive but separate maps stitched together with loading screens. Beyond the horizon of any one map is nothing. It's just the edge of the game, an endless empty space beyond that you're never going to see without serious portal exploiting or bugging. When exploring Tyria, you'll constantly be funneled into specific portals and choke points that will load the next map in a largely unimmersive way. Further, unless at a town or an outpost, you'll mostly just be with your current party, starting at the same location, going in the same direction to the same place, and rarely splitting up. No stumbling upon other players as you go, busy with their own struggles and successes. Because of this, in Guild Wars, it's so much more obvious that you're interacting with software rather than a meaningful simulated other world, and it makes it that much harder to suspend my disbelief. For such a fundamental thing people look for in an MMO, it's a huge drawback that ArenaNet really don't deliver on, and likely, single-handedly, caused their U-turn on what they declared the genre of their game to be. There are perks to the Prophecies approach, for sure, particularly on the technical side. If someone causes a fatal error somehow and crashes the game, it's only that map that closes down and only those few players currently in it that suffer. Or when a new patch comes out, not everybody has to be kicked instantly offline. Or if a spawn for a boss bugs or something, the map can be spun down and fired back up just fine. But there are some immersive qualities too. Reloading maps enabled ArenaNet to have a degree of randomness and predictability in their enemy patrols and boss spawns that World of Warcraft was way more haphazard about. In WoW, it's very obvious that your questing and killing is kind of pointless and the things you fight are about to respawn. But in Guild Wars, creatures don't respawn until you completely leave and return later. So you get a sense that you're actually doing something. I often find myself looking beyond the boundaries of the maps in Guild Wars, where ArenaNet would litter enough assets and visitors to hint and suggest that there might be content there, with a kind of deeply imaginative longing that I never get in World of Warcraft. In WoW, I get the sense that Blizzard didn't want players looking too far out of bounds, because most anything that Blizzard hint at, the player can actually travel to. In Azeroth, if you really want, you can choose to spam jump against a slope and find another route. And 99% of the time if you do it, there's nothing there but barren, empty wastelands. Open waters or empty hilltops, Blizzard have to back everything they do up with something substantive, while ArenaNet could comfortably litter Tyria with floating wizards' towers, ships and docks, ruined cities and castles that are in the distance you never really expected to enter anyway, and you're not punished for being teased with. The devs know you can't get there. I do believe it's possible for an MMO to take the Guild Wars approach of separate maps like this and hide it well enough that it doesn't impact your immersion. This is largely what the sequel, Guild Wars 2, was gunning for, and Sidebar probably still failed at. And I do appreciate that it takes considerable amount of time before most Prophecies players realize what's happening with the structure of the game. During those early hours, maybe they are just as immersed as any World of Warcraft player. But ultimately, ArenaNet's version falls very short, and it's not even close. Azeroth is a real world to visit on the internet. Tyria is a big video game. I will note that, interestingly, despite having a beautiful and real open world, Blizzard didn't show it off as well as they could have. They also broke their game into smaller maps with specific choke points connecting them that you're heavily incentivized to pass through. This was a real surprise to me. Was this necessary? Aren't you betraying the beautiful thing you've made here? It was probably done to help delineate between regions which otherwise would blend poorly, or to have a more directed sense of progress on your adventure, keep people wandering out of their depth, that kind of thing. Either way, as there are no loading screens, it still feels very good in Blizzard, even if I have to go from a specific road to get from one area of the world to the next. Further, I find that World of Warcraft is always careful and goes to great lengths to preserve the sense of a physical adventure. If you want to travel, you have to find a physical mechanism or vehicle for doing so. You can rarely, if ever, teleport, and if you did, then the story justified it. It was a gnome device or a warlock portal or whatever. If you want to cross continents, you need to let the vehicle actually physically move you out into the ocean and back to shore on the other side. Even when you die, where most games would be content to teleport your physical body to a checkpoint or whatever, Blizzard make the time to make a physical movement mechanic out of it as you wander in ghostly form. Then they play with the death mechanic in more immersive ways. They disable player chat because, screw your convenience, why should a player be able to speak while dead? Or having unique NPCs only offer quests to the dead? Or having just one of the player classes interact with ghosts where others can't? And so on. Back to the sense of a physical adventure and travel. These are all things that Guild Wars knows nothing of. Guild Wars decided on some level that travel was not valuable gameplay, and the combat was the main thing to be excited about. So let's ignore the immersive benefits and cut the busy work. You can teleport to any town or outpost you've already visited for free, without time gate or question or justification. Just go. There's no long become a ghost mechanic, just resurrect at a shrine. Did you just fail and wipe a hardcore intermission? No problem, warp to the other side of the world while dead and magically be alive again. Is the story right now that we're stranded in a desert with no way back home? Just teleport back home anyway, who cares? Many campaign missions will conclude and entirely unimmersively teleport your character further forward into a later region of the world with absolutely zero real explanation of how you got there. It's up to you to infer. Every single time you visit a town or an outpost, you won't teleport in near the gate or the dock or whatever. You'll be apparated at a random spot somewhere in the city and left to imagine how your character got to exactly that place in Lion's Arch before you moved to do whatever job you were going for. It's definitely true that a lot of this is convenient, but in the world of immersion, I don't like any of these things. Another issue with Guild Wars is how minimally you actually interact with the world. Jumping is the biggest thing. You cannot jump in the world of Tyria. You can only type /jump into the software's chat box to trigger a slow emote. From a purely design standpoint, I won't hesitate to call this an arbitrary thing that shouldn't really affect the game's standing. Just as a player can acclimate how slow World of Warcraft Classic is, a player can acclimate and forget that they aren't jumping after a little while in Tyria. But jumping, even if it never meant anything for combat or for exploration, really hurts Guild Wars for not being possible. The game does suffer for not giving its players this one basic freedom. It would have cost them a lot of potential players, and I keenly remember this particular topic being the main talking point for the game for many years. Don't get Guild Wars, you can't even jump in that game. Speaking of emotes, WoW has more of them, and unlike the Guild Wars ones, you can use them while moving. Some emotes trigger automatically as you type in chat. Like as you have a conversation, your avatar will actually emote to show you're talking. If you put a question mark in chat, your avatar will automatically seem curious. My character will sit themselves on the floor when I go AFK. These are brilliant things. Sure, Guild Wars definitely has the better dance emotes, but WoW emotes actually have voice cues as well. You can sit in chairs in WoW. You can open gates and doorways way more regularly. You open chests and barrels more regularly too. Sure, Guild Wars does have a chest system with specific keys that drop on enemies, but the drop rates are all wrong, and you can't get much exclusive or fun out of the chest, so it's mostly ignored. In World of Warcraft, players are always rolling and competing to see who gets to smash the barrel or whatever. WoW has gathering professions that let you go and collect herbs and do mining or logging, and then go back and craft with this stuff. There is no equivalent in Guild Wars. All of these world interactions build to a much more polished and pleasant experience for those who want to roleplay, or even just play casually but still feel somewhat immersed, and they aren't in Guild Wars. It goes further. World of Warcraft has proper simulated day and night cycle, while Tyria just locks some maps to daytime or some maps to nighttime, or maybe if you're really lucky it'll be sunset or something. Time doesn't actually move. World of Warcraft has simulated weather. Fogs and rains will descend on an area where, again, Guild Wars has to simply turn it on or off based on region and leave it there. Rain is hardly ever used in the first place. And Blizzard was so thorough. Your attempts to chat with the enemy alliance or horde players get scrambled to seem like another language. That system's applied to NPCs too. Warlock minions have strange names that seem to be seeded by your character name but you don't actually control. You get an experience bonus for being sure to log out and rest in taverns and towns. You need to use actual skills to get user interface functionality, like marking enemy locations or seeing gathering objectives on the minimap. One of the most interesting things I think Blizzard recognized was in identifying how immersive a sense of permanence in decision-making could be. Let me explain. They put limits on things that look like they should be arbitrary and free to mess with. Take, for example, not being able to rename your hunter pet more than once or twice lifetime. Guild Wars would call that an arbitrary annoyance and give you maximum freedom. In fact, you could change the pet name whenever you liked. But Blizzard knew how connected to that creature and your character and the world you'd become when you're living with specific limitations like this. There are some things Guild Wars does better. The world map parchment art is extremely captivating and very immersive, and I think that Guild Wars does item models and inventory stuff better. Every item that drops has a particular model that appears on the floor you can properly look at even when it's not in your inventory. You can drag and drop things from your inventory to physically place them on the ground, and you can have other people see them and other people pick them up. You can drop individual golden coins on the floor and make long breadcrumbs or pictures. In World of Warcraft, they cut these corners. Most items and trophies exist purely as icon art in the user interface, no further. So if you try to move them out of your inventory, it just destroys it, and it's readily apparent that you're interacting with a database rather than anything tangible. But that's a pretty minor thing for Guild Wars to have got right. I think it's fair to say that one of World of Warcraft's defining qualities is how immersive and real its world feels, and it's definitely something Blizzard focused on deeply. ArenaNet were blatantly more interested in other things at the heart of their game, and as a result, Guild Wars can't keep up. If there were any fundamental comparison between the two products, this is it, and I find World of Warcraft to be the much better experience. Environments. While we've already discussed the matter of quest quantity, that doesn't fully describe an MMO's content. For this category, I want to ask a question, and it's kind of the ultimate nerd question I always used to see during Guild Wars 1's heyday. Which world was bigger, Tyria or Azeroth? Which one has more landmass, more places to go, to see and be? And of the two, which had the more satisfying, high-quality places to go? So let's talk all things environment, starting with world size. One way to handle this topic would be to precisely compare what the developers had specifically rendered and dumped into their games, and leave it there. But I'm not sure that tells the full story. The speed we walk, run, or move on a mount plays a big role. Our ability to teleport and fast travel or any other movement mechanic has a huge effect on how big a world feels. And isn't that what really matters? How it feels? Blizzard's near singular ambition was to create a meaningful virtual environment. So make no mistake, Azeroth feels huge. They paid a heavy toll to accomplish that. Mostly, it's because you move extremely slow. You move so excruciatingly slow in WoW Classic compared to most modern MMOs, even those for the time, that I'm sure they burned a lot of potential players over the years in that initial hump. Classes rarely get movement speed interactions, and where they do, like me as a hunter, they come with their downsides. It shouldn't be news to you that gaining a mount is one of the biggest motivators for leveling and playing in World of Warcraft Classic. That's not an accident. So not only do you move slow in Azeroth, but you feel small too. Many assets and towns seem to be scaled up and presented at 1.5 or even double the size they should be, just to impress the magnitude of the world upon you. It feels bigger and more sprawling and bolder without Blizzard actually having to put in the real effort of filling in these vast environments with appropriately sized assets. And it works! As soon as you're used to the pace and your expectations are in check, Azeroth's a treat. Earlier we discussed the fact that World of Warcraft goes to great lengths to preserve the sense of a physical adventure. Well, it's here that all those immersive features and objectives come home to rest. They put the environment center stage and give every place in Azeroth's twin continents that extra time to shine. But the big models do only go so far. What I'm about to say may largely be because my first character was a Tauren on the continent of Kalimdor, but many of the maps and places filling Azeroth seem seriously limited on assets and points of interest. It really feels as though the entire continent, half of the game, was given far less time and attention than the other one, with Blizzard possibly rushing to get it made before launch, though I don't know if this is true or not. A lot of maps pretty much boil down to being a linear corridor of explanation, just widened to the point that they feel like a field, and then a handful of mines, outposts, and objects get sprinkled on the grass for good measure. Perhaps it was for the sake of saving players' frame rates on older rigs, perhaps it was a lack of inspiration or talent from the environment designers, but most areas I adventure in WoW are actually not that detailed. It's lots of overscaled bushes and tree leaves obscuring your view, but not much more. Especially true for Kalimdor, but not exclusively true. Go to the Eastern Kingdoms and things are definitely better. The undead areas are for sure my favourite to explore. But regularly, even on this continent, if you're not at a specific town or dungeon or doing a specific thing, it can all feel very bland. Now let's look at Tyria. As I already said, Azeroth feels huge. It is huge. But the truth is that I think Tyria is bigger, both in scope and asset density and quality. And I'll justify this comment. I could count and compare the number of World of Warcraft zones versus Guild Wars maps to see which has more. But it's a rather arbitrary exercise when the size of the zones in both games can vary massively. Another consideration is the fact that World of Warcraft included many dungeons to explore, whereas Guild Wars had only a few. On reflecting this, World of Warcraft might seem instinctively bigger to you, but meanwhile, where WoW had integrated its cities and PvP areas into the zones themselves, Guild Wars has all of its towns, outposts, and PvP arenas as entirely separate extra places you can explore on top of the open world PvE areas. And look at this. Guild Wars Prophecy's campaign missions were essentially every bit as large and sprawling and rich as any open world map, but they acted more like dungeons in that they're only meant to be played in a linear fashion. They're out in the open and they account for a vast amount of Prophecy's playable space, but beyond the initial cutscenes and objectives you do there, they don't have any quests or anything. So, are Guild Wars campaign missions valid areas of the world or not? But if you are curious about even just open world zones in Azeroth versus standard maps in Tyria, because ultimately most of them are comparable in size, WoW clocked in by my count at 41 zones. There are 23 maps for the one continent and there are 18 for the other. Meanwhile, Prophecies, we won't count towns like Lion's Arch and so on, is a much meatier 54 maps. Add those towns, or any explorable terrain from the additional 25 campaign missions, it's pretty clear how much bigger Tyria was to see. Perhaps it is fair to trade Prophecy's campaign missions for Azeroth's dungeons. We'll talk more about the similarities between those later in the review. But for numbers, that would be 19 World of Warcraft dungeons, failing to match up to 25 Prophecy's campaign missions, and an open world of 41 failing to hit 54. You could be sympathetic to Azeroth and bump up World of Warcraft's dungeon number by counting stuff like each wing of the Scarlet Monastery as a totally separate dungeon, sure, and now you have a bigger number, but it doesn't address the fact that most World of Warcraft dungeons, especially single wing experiences, are fairly limited interior adventures that don't come close to the comparatively titanic regions you traverse during a Prophecy's campaign mission. This still isn't including for Tyria, the multiple pre-searing maps and catacombs, which are kind of separate and I haven't added in yet, the 8 Guildhall maps from launch, or its own dungeons, like the Fissure of Woe and the Underworld, Sorrow's Furnace, and eventually the Tomb of the Primeval Kings. Tyria is just bigger, a lot bigger. Here's a fun thought experiment to any player who's played both. Just try to imagine how long it would take to do a World of Warcraft style flight path from Fort Rannoch to Yak's Bend. It would take ages, let alone from somewhere like the Maguma Jungle to the Crystal Desert. Not only do I think that Prophecies was just straight up bigger, but I think pound for pound, it took longer to traverse also. Sure, in Guild Wars, you never felt like you needed a mount or were moving too slow. There were lots of skills to get around and augment your speed, unlike in WoW. But as mentioned, in Guild Wars there's also no sense of jumping or climbing around in the content. So ArenaNet could often force players to walk through long, winding canyons, up and down obscure routes and through weird back roads, just to gain a little bit of elevation that a World of Warcraft would just jump up or sneak up the edge of the map somehow. Direct A to B travel didn't happen much in Guild Wars 1, so you'd end up feeling the environments more. Then consider, as a team game, that it would be pretty rare to sneak around between enemy patrols and spawns. Usually, someone or some AI would accidentally aggro a patrol you were trying to avoid or didn't anticipate, like a pop-up group, and since you can't really survive in Guild Wars 1 while split up, more on that later, the whole group would learn to just carefully and meticulously kill everything as you travel. This isn't a game with very sticky, position-oriented combat, and it means that travel time was very slow unless you were specifically building for racing around. And then there's the matter of asset density. I'd argue Tyria has more going on in its areas, and this is actually very easy to think about because so many environments exist in both games. Compare a place like the Prophecy's Sagelands, with its rocky, red mesas and canyons filled between luscious plants and waters, to a place like the World of Warcraft Thousand Needles, which is essentially going for the same thing, but it's just a lot of empty space between the high peaks in WoW. The ruins of Lordaeron or Alterac against Rin or Draskir. Compare the Guild Wars 1 Salt Flats to the World of Warcraft Shimmering Flats. Both places are portraying the exact same type of area, and many of the Guild Wars 1 places have so much more detail you'd think it released 4 years apart, not 4 months. I'll note that for the purposes of this review, and any of the footage you might have been watching, I'm not using the 2017-2018 new fog and LOD distance graphics settings for Guild Wars. I'm giving you the most vanilla experience I can. I'm also not using any add-ons or post-processing for WoW Classic either. Interestingly, I think most players have never truly recognized which game had the larger, more detailed world. And despite everything I've just listed out to you, if you asked me right now, which world is bigger, Azeroth or Tyria? I would say Azeroth. Because Azeroth feels bigger. Because I'm not teleporting everywhere. Because I don't just play my campaign mission once, I grind my dungeon 4 to 10 times in a row and really get to know the place before moving in. Because I'm constantly reminded of just how far away Orgrimmar is when I'm at the Harathi Highlands. My Hearthstone always seems to be on cooldown, and this is the 4th quest that is asking me to travel back and forth through those places. I see the travel routes again and again, while in Guild Wars, no matter how grand or epic, once I've done it once, I'm skipping it with instant teleportation. Guild Wars 1 undermines its world scale and undermines its size by having you skip most of it. Tyria shrinks the more you play. And there's another elephant in the room. Purpose for exploring in the first place. We already talked about quests and how WoW has so many compared to Guild Wars, even if they're also lazily implemented. But it means WoW has always given you a reason to be at a place if you want it. In Tyria, there are so few quests that there's basically no reason to explore a lot of the world. No, really, especially at launch before cartography titles and stuff like that were a thing. If there's no quest and no boss to capture a skill from, well, you're probably never going to that area of the world. Entire maps would be ignored by players just going through the motions. Even worse, because of the lower level cap and the fact that most experience in Guild Wars is baked into campaign progression and quest rewards, there's little reason to grind enemies for XP or loot in these distant, lonely, untouched places. There's a certain romance to those remote corners of a vast online world, but really, this just wasn't done well. Tyria's setting, with WoW's quest quantity, would have been incredible, but it never happened, and massive chunks of the Guild Wars experience get completely unplayed. One place that both games seem to fall down at is with texture issues, world holes, and clipping. Don't get me wrong, neither game has a terrible number of them. The average player would have to look quite hard, but it only took me one flight over Orgrimmar on my first evening of playing World of Warcraft to notice holes in the bridge turrets below that in plain view, and other issues dotted around. Guild Wars Prophecies has a similar problem, particularly if you play the campaign missions in reverse. Now, there's absolutely no reason to do this whatsoever, but if you do, you'll see just how quickly and sometimes sloppily constructed the roads are. There are world holes all over the place. The developers just didn't anticipate players to view every angle, and as such, it can be immersion breaking at times. This is probably a good example and evidence of some of the corner cutting the much smaller studio ArenaNet had to do in order to keep pace with the juggernaut like Blizzard. Now, if I end my environment comparison right here, I think I would give the victory to Guild Wars. It is the bigger world to me, and it is on average a prettier world to explore, even if it undermines itself. However, let's talk about towns and specific places to be. The big hubs of player activity. I don't mean just towns, but anything as well that would have a player repeating the content lots and lots. Something World of Warcraft has in abundance, particularly with its dungeon systems. How great are these environments? How divergent are they from one another? Here, World of Warcraft is the clear winner. The engine is clearly just better coded and capable of doing more exciting things. For one thing, since it has a valid Y-axis. In Guild Wars, it's not just that you can't jump. It's that there's no way for the engine to detect whether an enemy player is above or below you. So the developers rarely have roads and bridges crisscrossing or going above and below one another or doing interesting things. Guild Wars is mostly a flat game. Azeroth doesn't have to worry, so when it puts in the effort, it has all kinds of beautiful hubs to explore, like spiraling towers to climb, oceans and rivers and lakes to swim in, bridges to hide under, trees to climb, or whatever else. World of Warcraft has interiors too, tight spaces where you can actually get under a roof, like an inn or a bar, and actually have meaningful content and interactions there. Prophecies, in fact nearly all of Guild Wars 1, including its later campaigns, never got the smaller scale environments down like World of Warcraft did. You're almost never properly indoors in a small space. Azeroth isn't scared to be claustrophobic when you're spelunking in the Wailing Caverns, cleaving undead in the Shadowfang Keep, or exploring the libraries of the Scarlet Monastery. Another cool point of coding is how WoW is able to have players explore on land below the sea level, such as a moment in the Wailing Caverns. They can make rivers with proper waterfalls, creating pockets of air wherever they like, something ArenaNet hasn't accomplished even in their 8-year-long developed sequel, and certainly not in Prophecies when there was no swimming at all. And then there's the interactable moving stuff too. In WoW, there are dynamic moving elevators rising you to the top or bottom of the Thunder Bluff or at the Thousand Needles. There are boats that sail the ocean, zeppelins that travel the skies that you can hang out on or get cozy below deck. There's no loss of control, no tricks. They're all living, moving, real things in the world. Perhaps it's true that when a drawbridge lowers or raises, an avalanche blocks a path, a wall is destroyed, or whatever in the Guild Wars campaign, that it is impressive. But these tend to be very binary, one-and-done cutscene moments that you don't get to really sink your teeth into. It's Blizzard that nailed this stuff. Guild Wars has to fake basic things in cutscenes, and the moments are generally not awe-inspiring at all. There's absolutely no contest to compare Guild Wars Prophecies port towns, like say Lion's Arch or Port Sledge, to a place like Ratchet or Booty Bay in WoW. Take Thunderbluff or the Undercity. Is there a single Prophecies location that competes on this level, so full of wonder and depth? Absolutely not. You may disagree with the art style for World of Warcraft, sure, but these kinds of big and small environments with multiple layers and moving parts could have been done with the Guild Wars art style too, and they weren't. Azeroth is just so much more dense, so much more pleasurable to explore than what you get in Guild Wars, which, while pretty, ultimately amounts to wandering around on a flat plane under the skies for 95% of the game. Even when Sorrow's Furnace was added to Prophecies, a dungeon with wings by all rights, you don't feel like you're in a real cave or interior. The ceiling's too high. WoW was doing better constantly. Perhaps ArenaNet was overly concerned about our camera controls and claustrophobia, and maybe some of you value the decisions and art style they went with. But to me, World of Warcraft wins. Setting and plot. In several regards, both World of Warcraft and Guild Wars have very similar settings. They both have a high fantasy texture, large worlds populated by multiple intelligent races vying for control and to understand the worlds that they live in. There are magical disasters, the rise and fall of nations, and mysterious origins to ponder over. I think honestly, had I spent my earlier years as a World of Warcraft gamer instead of a Guild Wars one, I probably would have become every bit as invested in the one game's universe as I did with the other. They're similar enough that anyone looking to latch onto this type of setting could land either way. Though I hear that Blizzard are notorious for retconning, which ArenaNet are comparatively not, I don't believe such issues were relevant at this point in either of the franchise's life cycles. So let's get into some significant differences. As far as I can see, and although I think this changed in later expansions, WoW doesn't really have much of a plot progression at all. I get the feeling that maybe Blizzard were toying with the idea of having Azeroth be frozen in time and to not do much meaningful stuff to push the world forward so they could continue the RTSs for the main story. Maybe this is why it also took a few years for Burning Crusade to come out, and they ultimately changed their mind upon seeing the success of the MMO and how it so enormously usurped the RTSs themselves by that point. So there is no coherent, unifying story at all, really, in release World of Warcraft, beyond a bunch of minor events and irrelevant stories that the secondary quests, dungeons and raids are leading you through, and sometimes end up related. Once you reach the end game group content, I think it does somewhat coalesce into a specific thing, but for the most part, nothing really big happens in Azeroth in general. Despite this obvious deficiency, WoW is based in an established setting with lots of notable characters and places. Being built out of a pre-existing franchise was huge for this game. Now, I'm not a fan of the RTSs. This is seriously the first real time I've ever spent in Azeroth in any game. I don't know which of the characters or places at all are returning from the RTS 1 year prior, unless a friend tells me. I heard that the RTS dealt with the fall of the humans and the creation of the undead, among other things, so people like Sylvanas are important, but I only got these facts from the outside. The game itself doesn't really do anything to make me realise those connections. I suppose Blizzard could have done better, but I must acknowledge, even I, in this position, can feel the history of the place. There's something about Azeroth that feels very authentic, and that's because it is. The game has a real history, the history of the preceding products, and it's palpable. I'll note too that Azeroth has so many quests that, no matter how minor, you constantly get a sense that a lot of semi-exciting stuff might be going on. I remember hearing about an alternate nature dimension in an emerald or something during one of my early Tauren quests, and would be excited to see them develop on that stuff in subtle ways in the future. Guild Wars has absolutely no pre-existing information for its world and setting. It has to build stuff as it goes, so the actual quantity of lore and setting building here is way, way lower. But for what they do make, ArenaNet do a good job. It makes its opening nation, Ascalon, feel especially rich in backstory. You get to see it through multiple time periods, before and after a great magical disaster, and WoW never did anything so cool as that. ArenaNet fleshed out a full royal family and a path of succession for the current king, emphasized a giant wall these people had made, included an ancient enemy. They talked about a massive conflict among humans that had occurred years prior but we never really get to see, and so on. Beyond the opening region, things tend to get thinner and thinner with Guild Wars. The mountain ranges are where you head next, with a dwarven civil war, and next is a failed human state now ruled by a cult. But then what? A mysterious jungle with some people who went missing once? A desert filled with generic lost civilizations that we don't get too much information on? Then you go back to the mountains and some volcanoes. Obviously, I'm being reductionist, but for Tyria, it quickly gets to the point they're mostly suggesting at history without elaborating much. A good example is in the desert, where they just throw a single word at you like Marganite with absolutely nothing else, and you're left to wonder what that is. Later, the developers actually went and built a full campaign around the Marganites, but for now, it was pretty much empty of meaning beyond its delivered context. You might consider that World of Warcraft did things just the same, but World of Warcraft has a more natural spread for meaningless filler that might become something, and stuff that already means something, because it had the previous games. I would say that most stuff in Prophecies was just unexplained and there for speculation. It's kind of like the Dark Souls thing, and an efficient way of developing when you don't have much time or manpower. Sometimes these mysteries are extremely compelling, like with the Wizard's Tower I mentioned, but sometimes it felt a bit off. I remember in particular some strange-looking beast people things hanging around with bandits in the tutorial areas, but they were never expanded on or explained, and ended up looking kind of random rather than deliberate. WoW feels more uniform, and really it kind of has to be, since players have all these different starting positions all around the world depending on the race that they play. It has to feel like the Night Elf stuff is at the same standard as the Orc stuff. I already mentioned that as far as environments and assets go, Blizzard seem to have dropped the ball here, but story seems better. Though, honestly, I'm not sure what my race are all about or why we're in the Horde. Guild Wars isn't uniform, maybe because it doesn't have to be. Because in Guild Wars, all the players are starting at the same place and progressing in the same direction. I do think ArenaNet was smart to focus on their first 3 regions, and especially the very initial one, because those are definitely the places most people will see the most of. Not everyone who picks up the game will see the funnel zones, so maybe they don't have to be so good, but they will see the first. You can lean on Mystery and Enigma more in the later areas. Having all the players start in one place with one background gave ArenaNet another massive opportunity that Blizzard never seized on at all. Guild Wars had a main quest line. For those that haven't played, you can think of the Prophecies campaign as one long epic quest chain. It begins right after character creation, and when it ends, you've been to every region of the world and reached max level. It's a specific, linear story with characters who live and die, and voice acting and cutscenes where specific people go on a specific journey through the world like in any single-player RPG. It blew my mind this year to realize that World of Warcraft Classic doesn't have anything like that. For Guild Wars, the main story offers a constant companion to you and a sense that you have a purpose to what you're doing, even during side quests, which tend to link the main events of the moment in a rich and meaningful way. I would say for most people, beating the main campaign was their near singular reason to explore in Guild Wars. To keep leveling and getting new skills and items, making new friends and having new adventures, it all snaked back to the main story. I can't imagine Guild Wars Prophecies having worked without it. The whole world would have seemed so shallow and empty. One downside to this approach that Blizzard probably realized was that it would inevitably end. The story would have to conclude, there would have to be a final cutscene, that last moment, and then players would lose their main reason for wanting to play and potentially stop. That happened a lot. Blizzard were probably thinking bigger picture. They didn't like the idea of that risk because their subscription fee model and entire philosophy was to make sure the player never felt like they'd run out of things to do or got to an end. So they didn't have a main story. With no sub fee in their business model, ArenaNet weren't so bothered. I think they figured people would have fallen in love with the combat and the skills and the PvP by the time they reached the end and would transition to that anyway. Nobody playing PvP is looking for more story. The only challenge was to make sure you actually went to do it. In the end, I think it's fair to say that Guild Wars 1 was both a better game for having a campaign storyline and also did have a retention issue. And maybe it was the single campaign with an end format that did it in. There would always be a massive spike of population for Guild Wars with a new release, which then slowly filtered out as players beat the game. It's definitely true that these population spikes occur in MMOs in general, or even just games in general, hell, products in general. But I do look back at my time in Guild Wars and feel that the beating of a campaign moment tended to be a big point of deflation for many of us. Another possible downside to the main story in Guild Wars is how aggressively it defines your backstory and agenda. ArenaNet dictate your place in the world far more specifically than Blizzard do in WoW, which makes Guild Wars a fundamentally worse role-play and sandbox setting. Your character actually speaks and interacts in the cutscenes, which is great until they do or say something you don't agree with and you're ripped from the moment. I think ArenaNet were cautious of doing that much, so we get the other side of the coin instead. When our character speaks, it's often in a bland, somewhat non-committal and robotic way that expresses as little personality as possible, just in case the cutscene personality tampers too much with what the player might have been imagining their avatar's personality to be. You can definitely still roleplay in Guild Wars. It's just that you're more likely to be roleplaying along a specific idea than in WoW. Ultimately, neither game is a perfect sandbox. You're nearly always going to be role-playing as an Azeroth citizen or along the lines of any specific race in WoW, but I do think that game has way more options. In general, though, I cannot speak positively enough about the main Guild Wars storyline. It feels so good seeing my character up on center stage with all the other heroes, even if I remain a bit of a nobody throughout. It's interesting going to new areas of the world because even if there isn't actually that much setting information to this mysterious jungle, I at least have all this story content to engage with that the main plot is offering, about how a band of guerrilla fighters have established a camp among the trees and know a hidden truth about evil cultists. Sure, the story can be kind of boiled down as an excuse to get you to go on a big world tour, and it isn't as well crafted or frankly on the same plane of existence as contemporary single-player BioWare experiences like Jade Empire. And sure, many of the cutscenes were kind of janky and a lot of people wanted to skip them every bit as much as they did want to skip the walls of text with the quests, but it's brilliant to know I could legitimately offer you spoilers right now about which characters survive or die as the journey progresses. It's cool to realize that the Prophecy story actually spans 2 years of game time, and the gameplay was good. When you loaded into a cooperative mission, you genuinely had to try so that your mission critical NPC wouldn't die and wipe the whole run. In WoW, you could pretty much graveyard rush any quest, any dungeon, or any open world challenge, but in Guild Wars, if you want to beat the story, you have to really engage with it. A lot of the campaign is skippable if you really want. I know I certainly skipped a large chunk to get to the desert quickly on my first character, and only 4 of the missions really have to be done to be technically finished. But when players realize there's no point to skipping because the story is the game, I find it doesn't bother me much. I think the campaign's done a lot for Guild Wars' replayability over the subsequent decade too. I could ask a friend right now if they wanted to play that game, and if they said yes, we'd know exactly why and how. It would be to beat the story. We wouldn't be doing it to emotionally invest in some huge product that has no potential end. We wouldn't be reliant on a massive population to sink into and sustain our enjoyment. It'd be the same as going back to play the original Borderlands or Halo Combat Evolved right now, and totally possible. So there are 2 fundamentally different approaches to delivering story and lore in these games, even if the stories themselves have a very similar texture. I don't really see the point in offering my value judgment of WoW's Titans or Old Gods against Tyria's 5 human gods, or the Cataclysm of Ore against the Sundering, the resurrection of Prince Rurik versus Arthas, the Twisting Nether and the Mists, the Great Northern Wall against Thoradin's Wall. It's enough for me to know that a lot of this stuff is similar and probably just as captivating on one side as the other. It just depends what games you've played a lot of. I do think that on the WoW side, they're much more cavalier and wanton just to explain, oh, magic did it, and corruption did it, but Guild Wars has its share of those tropes also. I do find it interesting that World of Warcraft later would adopt the Guild Wars way of having an actual progression of events to follow, but for now at Classic, it's not there. Which game did it better? I'm going to say Guild Wars. There may be less here, but ArenaNet built a coherent, believable enough fantasy world from scratch, where, because of the existence of a main story, it feels there's a lot of purpose to what's happening. The world in Guild Wars isn't just a backdrop for your roleplay, it's a thing to sit up and pay explicit attention to. Multiplayer and endgame. You might expect one part of this review to point out that World of Warcraft has dungeons, while Guild Wars Prophecies does not have dungeons, so clearly WoW was the better game, particularly as a cooperative experience. But as we established earlier, I don't actually believe this is true, because the 25 cooperative storyline missions in Guild Wars Prophecies' main story are played pretty much just like WoW dungeons. In fact, the co-op missions may be even better because they can't be graveyard rushed and they offer real mechanics. WoW dungeons are nearly all simply wander around this place until you find a boss. Sometimes the environment does something, sometimes you have an escort or a wave assault, and the bosses definitely get more interesting at higher levels. The first several dungeons have pathetic final bosses, but the experience is mostly wandering around and being careful not to over aggro. In Guild Wars, missions are also wandering around being careful not to over aggro, but they go further than that, with consistently variant mechanics at play, like trebbing opponents, activating shrines, racing against time limits, holding environmental objects, and the rest of the standard fare, escorts, wave assaults, and so on. Every mission, too, has a bonus hidden objective, with any number of contrived mechanics to beat it. And while WoW dungeons can have quests change them up or add additional objectives, they're often not that long or that good. Sure, some Guild Wars stuff can be cheesed and blitzed through with modern balance and skill abuse, but particularly at launch, the campaign was a very solid cooperative experience that had some really difficult things appropriately positioned later in the game. There was a real curve. Even better, because of the low level cap, you don't so much have that World of Warcraft experience where a higher level player returns to previous content and destroys it all, making the gameplay meaningless for everyone else. With just 20 levels, even someone at the very end of the game might come back and have a real experience in most of the missions. One thing to discuss is the matter of replayability and repeatability. I personally am a bit of a sucker for grind, so I really like it when the World of Warcraft dungeons ask me to play them many times in a row. I get a good connection with the place, I learn slightly different strategies and optimizations as I continue to replay, and that's all stuff that Guild Wars misses out on completely. You basically just do the stuff the once, maybe a second time if you missed a bonus objective, maybe a third if you're helping a friend. But that's it. And ArenaNet really didn't tap into as much value as they could have from those missions. To ask for grind from them might be wrong, however, as ultimately it was the game's philosophy at its heart to break away from these grindy MMO tendencies and give players something new. Then we have the matter of actual endgame. Campaign missions and dungeons may have been used as platforms to level and teach players, but what about when we're at the end? Guild Wars was rather lacking. The idea to push people into PvP doesn't really work if you've also built a ton of repeatable PvE stuff that might keep them perpetually distracted. So there wasn't much, but ArenaNet did mix in a few things, and perhaps this was a mistake as it confused their message. Launch saw the inclusion of 2 endgame locations, known as the Fissure of Woe and the Underworld. These were large, open maps equivalent to anything in the rest of the world, with multiple branching quests that were excruciatingly difficult and special gear that could be dropped only from them. Some later patches, that nonetheless were very early in Guild Wars' life, altered the Tomb of the Primeval Kings to become an endgame location, added the Sorrow's Embrace dungeon and the Titan quests, all as post-campaign content to shore things up. I'm not sure anything from this list was ever as thrilling as WoW raiding was. As far as I know, launch WoW had 2 super difficult 40-man raids. One of them was pretty much exclusively a boss fight, but they really captured that community excitement and imagination. Even now, years later with the relaunch, people have been desperate to rush to the end as fast as possible and form guilds just to play these 2 raids, even if the content within them isn't that fantastic. I believe I heard a dev story that one of them was created in just a single week. Talking difficulty, the Guild Wars endgame with its god realms were brutal in their own right, and often overlooked just how punishing this feature was. The equivalent to raiding. You had to pay to enter a god realm, and if you and your allies wiped because you didn't know what was coming, you straight up lost that money you spent to get in there. And then, you couldn't even try to pay to get into the end game unless your region, that is all of North America or all of Europe, had a thing called the Favor of the Gods. Favor of the Gods was something won for a whole continent of players exclusively by PvPers. That's right, unless PvPers on your continent were actively winning in a totally other format of the game, you were told to get stuffed and that you weren't allowed to do the Guild Wars version of a raid. Best go get good at PvP instead so that maybe you can win it for the continent. That's pretty hardcore. And while eventually, in 2007, the studio changed this system, we are talking about those early days in this review. The pains don't stop there. Let's assume you've had Favor of the Gods, you've paid your money, you've got inside, and you might be good enough at the combat to not instantly die. You now have a new, full-sized map to fumble around, participating in quests with extremely trolly, dangerous mechanics. Each quest could be considered somewhat analogous to a wing of a dungeon in World of Warcraft. You could choose first to head to the Eternal Battlefield, or maybe then the Spider Cave, go for the Lake of Fire later, whatever order you wished for. Some quests were made to be so ridiculously trolly and punishing, it would be almost impossible to know how to beat it on your first time. For example, instantly spawning a mission-critical NPC a mile away, surrounded by enemies. At the second you collect the quest, they'll be dead in 2 seconds, and oh dear, you've been wiped and kicked. So that was the Guild Wars endgame. But unlike Blizzard's, they never kept adding after this. ArenaNet needed to move on to the next campaign with their own versions of later missions and difficult quests, so Prophecies was left here. And before long, it was World of Warcraft doing endgame better. Guild Wars never played with increasing the party limit beyond 8 or later 12, and they just never had that same rush, the same spectacle, or that thrill that WoW raiding had. As arbitrary and frankly even annoying I personally find high party sizes to be in MMOs, the excitement and thrill people felt in 2005, and even now, cannot be denied. Stepping away from endgame for a moment, let's look at the general cooperative multiplayer experience in both games. I think the general impression and instinct for Guild Wars is that it doesn't have much real multiplayer cooperative stuff because of the way it instances its maps, because of its hired AI henchman system, and particularly I think this did become a big deal with their later campaigns. But back at Prophecies, I actually think both games were very similar. And if Guild Wars had a problem, it was actually the reverse and more to do with the solo gameplay. I'll explain. I would go as far as to say that almost every single Guild Wars PvE experience at launch is just like a World of Warcraft dungeon experience. A lot of people don't realize this, but it is true. Every secondary or primary quest you do, no matter how trivial, every exploration of a map to kill a boss for a drop or to capture a new skill, every new campaign mission you find, they were all group missions. Areas designed for parties of players, not individuals. As Guild Wars 1 progressed, the party size and the difficulty kept increasing from 2 players to 4 players to 6 to 8. But that's the way the game was structured. Leveling in dungeons in classic WoW for me right now in 2019 has given me an experience almost identical to playing Guild Wars 1 back in the day. Guild Wars 1 was entirely this. Healers on the backline calling that they're out of mana, tanks pulling enemies from other patrols with ranged weapons, trying not to over-aggro nearby crossing groups and wiping because you did, line of sighting and using player summons as a meat shield in the front, being mad at your ranger or your hunter for letting their pet aggro stupidly, trading loot that dropped or being mad because someone else got what you wanted. It's all exactly the same, and it's all extremely nostalgic and fun to me. Guild Wars isn't missing dungeons. It's entirely dungeons. Now, if you love co-op play, then you might see that as a massive perk for Guild Wars 1. An entire game built around one of your favorite elements of an MMO? Fantastic. And for a short time, I think it really worked for ArenaNet. Right around when a campaign released and there was a high population, there was an enormous amount of socializing and interacting with other players and going out and having meaningful fun together. As I mentioned, I wasn't there for the very initial launch of Prophecies, when this will have been at its finest, but even when I arrived around the time of the Sorry's Furnace update later, I was able to get a good taste. But on the whole, I actually think this heavy cooperative slanting might have been Guild Wars 1's biggest failure. Let me rephrase what we're talking about. The entire game is team content, so there is no sense of solo play. You could participate in a few solo farms for money, but to do that, you'd have to go through hours of leveling and getting skills and getting gear entirely co-op. And then your solo build would only be good for killing specific things in very specific areas, and you were never really sure if the developers condoned you playing solo in this way. There was one solo mission in the entirety of the story. Your party might very rarely sometimes split into smaller chunks for various bonus objectives during quests or campaign missions, and that's pretty much it. The only point in the game where you're having fun, meaningful solo gameplay on a long term is at the very start, in the tutorial areas of pre-searing. Here, the gameplay is fantastic and interesting and captivating in a way I would argue much else of Guild Wars Prophecies never managed to be. But it's lost as soon as you progress the story just a little bit. Then it's all group play going forward, fighting swarms of enemies designed to be taken out by swarms of players. So what about when the population runs low because everyone's progressed to endgame or to PvP and maybe it's off peak? What if you don't want to wait around ages to party up and meet people? Well, for this the developers added henchmen, AI companions that fill the roles of other players and allow you to get around on your own because they're always available to fill up your party and head out. But it's still not solo gameplay. You get your autonomy back, yes, but it's all the downsides of playing co-op without any of the upsides. All the mess and visual noise of multiple skill animations, which now have to be designed to be much more muted and smaller to not make the game look like a mess every second, the irritation of micromanaging AI, the diluted responsibility or necessity of even paying attention and trying, because ultimately what you individually do now is just 1/8 of the full team, so you may as well just WAS and D around and let the game play itself with your AI. And even when you are trying, you always have a diminished sense that you're important, or even seeing what you're doing. You're potentially 1/8 of the damage of the team. All the enemies are designed to take the damage from that many players, so you don't really get to see or feel your individual contribution ever. At least until raids, Blizzard stayed at just a 5-man party limit, which you can get some sense of. And you get none of the upsides. No satisfaction from saving an ally's life with healing or buffing their damage. Just unappreciative robot AI that gives you nothing more than cold indifference. No trading or snooping on other people's loot drops, as now a whopping 7/8 of all the money and gear is getting magically deleted by the bots, so you never get to look at it. No laughing with other players or strategizing when something goes wrong. There's limited chance for emergent moments, no one to share them with when they happen. And of course, there was always the possibility to play with just 1 or 2 friends and fill the rest of the team in with bots for a kind of middle ground, but this whole situation hamstrung Guild Wars 1 in one of the worst ways. And as a sidebar, they never addressed it in the upcoming years either, only making it worse by more quickly getting to the 8-man party limit and then introducing heroes, an even more formidable version of AI. Meanwhile, in World of Warcraft, most of what I'm doing when I'm questing and leveling is actually calibrated to be solo. Just like with Guild Wars, I have the choice to party up further if I want, and I actually find I do very regularly, just because of the threat of enemy alliance players when I'm wading out of my level depth, but it's not forced on me, and the game is so much better for it. I get to see exactly how much damage I did to that enemy. I have my own autonomy. The game generally looks cleaner. I'm not always being bagged down by AI aggroing patrols. I'm an adventurer in Azeroth, and I have control over my story. So, which game did its multiplayer and endgame elements better? This one's a real mixed bag, but overall, I think it has to be WoW. Its general dungeons are weaker than Guild Wars' general campaign stuff, but the closer to level cap you go, the better they get. Finally concluding with raiding and everything involved there. You have the epic items to go for, a couple of legendaries in at launch with their involved processes. I must admit, I myself never got to playing. And frankly, it's just a much more intelligent game with an actual balance of solo versus co-op gameplay than Guild Wars 1 ever was. Screw the jumping thing. This might have been one of ArenaNet's biggest mistakes. Game access. This is a bit of a weird category, but it's one I feel is very important, and that is all the factors that enabled or prevented a player from playing these games. With World of Warcraft, you're paying a subscription fee, which is an obvious limiting effect, and there's a certain added stress there to make sure you're logging in every day. The fact that one game had a sub fee and the other did not is obviously a huge factor that distinguishes the two studios enormously. However, since it's not something I genuinely believe affected the game's content much at the timescale I'm looking at in this review, it's not a point I really want to labour much. If this were a version of the review I proposed at the start, of Guild Wars Prophecies, Factions, and Nightfall versus the Drums of War, I would probably have a lot to say about value for money. But for now, Blizzard's neck is out of the noose. Many of us know our opinions on subscription fees and the necessity, or lack of necessity, to have one. My negative attitude to them hasn't changed at all from my hundreds of hours I now have in WoW Classic, but I will say that I think the added pressure to keep playing isn't always a bad thing. Some games, some products in general, have a real ebb and flow to them when you're really into them for a while and then very down on them later. You have to wade through a lot of muck to get to the good stuff sometimes, and then the good stuff is all the sweeter for having gone through it. I think the fact that the average subscription payer has that added push on themselves to keep playing even through those downtimes, and thus end up super into the game and seeing it for what it's really worth, has probably done a lot of good for WoW over the years. With Guild Wars, the day you get bored and put it down is, perhaps, ironically, even though you owed it forever, the last day you ever play it. You never feel that external force driving you back in. Playing WoW, you have to make an active decision to cancel the sub and leave the community. With Guild Wars, it's possible to stop playing by accident. Now, if you were a subscription fee hater or simply locked out of that as a possibility based on your IRL finances, Guild Wars clearly comes across very well. But there are other benefits to being a Guild Wars 1 player in terms of access that other MMOs weren't doing. First of all, no queues. In most MMOs, there would be queue times to even get in. Even here, in World of Warcraft Classic, years later, I find on launch I'm waiting in 5-6 hour queues just to get in and play sometimes. Perhaps, just like with the subscription fee, it's one of those things that gives me an extra push to get value out of my time once I'm in. But to me, this was a massive downside to WoW during the early days, and presumably will come back when new phases release. The stress of knowing one DC and then you're just a little bit too late when logging back in for your place to be held and you're locked out again, always in the back of your mind, is not fun. Nor is having to remote desktop into your home a few hours before work ends just to start queuing for WoW so you can actually play when you get in. Madness. Prophecies never had queues. It was always as simple as logging in and that was it. Neither did Prophecies ever have maintenance, where everyone globally is told they can't play a few hours. Nor did Prophecies ever have to go offline to stream a new patch. They could be regularly added whenever needed and not mess with the game too much. And why am I being locked out of dungeons in World of Warcraft for daring to enter 5 instances in the past hour? You can dance in and out of Guild Wars maps and instances all you like. These are all perks that Guild Wars players like myself enjoyed for years without realizing that other games, even ones with massive names and budgets, had absolutely no capability of doing. Beyond that is the server infrastructure. I spent most of my time as a Guild Wars 1 fan living in Europe, playing with Americans on American servers and in an American guild. It was never a problem. I could swap to Korean, Chinese, or international districts to get faster or slower ping at the click of a button, without even having to close the client. Blizzard went a different route, hard locking people to specific regions, and then to specific servers, and then to either Horde or Alliance. This has the obvious social and immersive benefits that Blizzard valued so dearly, but was immensely restrictive as far as game access and player freedom is concerned. One downside to Prophecies is true also, that with the heavily co-op nature of the game, you would often be 40 minutes, even hours into a run, just to find someone with a dodgy early 2000s internet connection disconnect, and they would be unable to rejoin. You'd be down a party member for the rest of the quest, mission, or dungeon, and there was no way around it. It was years before Guild Wars had a proper rejoin instant system, and even then it failed all the time. So Tyria had its share of problems. At least in Azeroth you could play mostly solo and not have to worry about someone else's internet being wonky. But overall, Prophecies and Guild Wars had so much game access quality of life and decent sides, minimal downtime, that I think is often criminally underappreciated and flat out wins this category. Combat. So we have reached the point of the review now where I've ran out of full script I wrote for myself. There are several more areas of comparison I wanted to go into, and I have lots of bullet points that I was going to take the time to expand into proper, let's say, communication for you all. But I never got that far. So going forwards, this is just going to be some live, off-the-cuff, casual commentary on the bullet points I'd written for myself a few months ago, and we'll run through them. So I do want to cover this subject material. It's just not going to be in a particularly great way. Hopefully that's fair with you guys. So the first of the categories that I was going for is combat, which is a category I was really excited to do, and I think most people wouldn't immediately wonder about for a comparison between these two MMOs. But obviously, it was one of the main things you're doing in the game. And this is a category I'm pretty much 100% confident I was going to give to Guild Wars 1. Listening to the review, you'll notice when I really stop and think about it, most of these categories are going to World of Warcraft. And it's because it just does it better or bigger or with more money in it and more features. So when it's all said and done, it's going to look like I really kind of hate Guild Wars 1. Combat, though, is a category that I really think counterbalances that, because it is just so much better in Guild Wars than it was in WoW. Some of my bullet points here. First of all, I would give to WoW, to be fair to it, that it has very interesting skills. There are certain abilities like Polymorph as a transform that you just don't see such wild stuff in Guild Wars anywhere near. There's abilities like Eagle Eye. There's Mind Control for the Priest. The idea of full-on letting a player take control of an enemy and just use it is wild. Like, they're very extreme with some of their skills and they don't really care. They're really extreme with their CCs and stuff as well. So from the perspective of using a crowd control, it's kind of fun to have like these really long stuns. And then you've got skills like Eyes of the Beast as well. That is just a weird skill that doesn't really help much, but lets me like look through my pet's eyes, and it's in the game and it's just kind of there. There's a lot of fun stuff like that in WoW that I do give it credit for. A lot of the Guild Wars skills are much more uniform and they follow a much closer rule set about what a skill is trying to do and why it's trying to do it. And it seems Blizzard were really cavalier and they played with the format a lot. Then you also have certain skills in WoW, a bit like Eyes of the Beast I mentioned there, that don't really have anything to do with combat. And I like that profession and class design. So like, for example, with the Mage being able to teleport, or like the Warlock being able to summon a portal and you can bring people in. These are really nice things that help that class get a leg up when maybe its profession skills, its actual in-combat abilities don't hold up. Like Warlock in particular, my understanding as I was playing through most of these dungeons and in most of the game, is the Warlock wasn't that good or wasn't really that valuable. Most people wanted mages, for example, for spell cleave and stuff. However, whenever the party member wasn't online for the night, who was on Warlock, it was a pain to get everyone together to do the dungeons now, and you realize how much you miss having that Warlock there. I like that. I like those skills that operate outside of combat and do something more. Guild Wars 1 did eventually go for that, way later with, say, the Eye of the North expansion. He had a skill that revealed chests, but WoW and Blizzard had been doing it way before, so I do credit them with that. A downside to WoW, and an observation I've made here, is the existence of global cooldowns. This is the idea of when you use an ability, no matter what it is, every single other ability out of all of your skills, and in WoW you have so many more skills than Guild Wars. That's not fundamentally good or bad, so there wasn't really a point of comparison for me. But every time you use a skill, the global cooldowns mean you can't like queue up the next one easily. You can't figure that out. So I believe that this happened in a lot of classic MMOs, and even to this day, because they kind of want to unify how much stress any one entity, any one unit, any one player can put on the servers. They really want to limit, like, okay, you're doing this action now, and you're not going to overlap with 30 actions all at once. You're just going to do it here and here. Guild Wars 1, because of its different network infrastructure and its different maps that it spun up, didn't have to deal with global cooldowns, so you could really cleanly and nicely queue things together. There were a few very specific little skill balance and mechanics that might have global cooldown-esque stuff, but Guild Wars avoided it, and its combat flows so much better. That's a perk even to this day with its sequel. So I don't like global cooldowns. They feel really lame, and ArenaNet put a lot of effort into their combat system to not have them, so that was pretty nice. The World of Warcraft energy mechanic for combat feels very weird. So, as I've mentioned, WoW definitely just kept trying to slow people down. Like, you can really feel that. One of the things is consumables, and I think that Blizzard might have imagined consumables being used in a different way to how they ultimately were. But a huge part of the cooperative, like, you know, engaging combat experiences in WoW is like, okay, do a pull, kill a group, and then sit there and wait while you eat and drink food so that everyone can get their mana back. And even if you're on a class that's not worrying about its mana right now, it doesn't matter. You still have to stop and wait. You still have to wait for your shaman healer or whatever to eat and drink and get back. And that just feels really weird. It feels very lame to always have my inventory open and I just sit down and eat, and then I get moving again, and then I stop and I sit down and eat again. It feels very arbitrary. It's basically just an economy sync. It's an interface for combat into economy, and that's it. And it slows things down in kind of an ugly way. I don't like that. Another thing I really don't like about WoW combat is how floaty it is. WoW is really imprecise and unclear about which skills you can use while moving, which skills you're going to interrupt if you try to move, which skills have what cones and operate in which ways, which skills you can use behind yourself. It's terrible. It feels very strange that as well in WoW, especially as a hunter, if I'm attacking, I'm constantly firing. And then when I use a skill, like an extra arrow skill, there's not really any animation to my character as I use that. It just, you know, I don't augment my next attack to now look like a dual shot or a multi-shot or whatever. It just comes flying out of me, you know, just that extra thing just appears. It doesn't hook into any real animation cycles. The whole thing feels really floaty, and I'm not impressed with that at all. In Guild Wars, if I'm playing a range and I have a bow and I decide I want to cast an arrow skill, what it will do is I will finish my current auto attack, and then my character will execute the skill. It will actually do the thing I told it, and you will watch it activating at that right time. But in WoW, you have this very strange, like, mixed, floaty design where you can never quite tell what skill is queued or is casting and when things get cancelled. I don't like it. It took me a long time to get used to it. And it's not just because it's fiddly or difficult to use. It's definitely something you can acclimate to. But on the whole, it just feels horrible. And floaty is the main word I can think of for that. The sound design, I've got a whole section on sound later, but the combat sound design, it particularly, is awful. The same blunt, lame noises played over and over and over again with very little variance. Another thing I really didn't like about WoW combat is the number of ways to mitigate damage. Like, there's so many different resists and misses and blocks and evades and obstructs, and they just constantly all flying out everywhere, and you have no idea why it is the way it is. You're just, like, constantly barraging stuff towards an enemy, and a bunch of them are getting randomly invalidated. Obviously, if there's a big level discrepancy between you and the thing you're fighting, that can compound that. I don't like that. I don't know why we have so many different phrases, and it's just so arbitrary. It's a bunch of random stuff, basically, to learn that felt very off to me. I did not like. I already mentioned the irritating mix of stationary skills and movement skills. That was a point here. The perk system in WoW. This combat section is kind of a profession section as well. The perk system I find really lame. It's restrictive. It's uninspired. The traits themselves are baffling to me. Like, one of the perks I got was you have a 1% chance to trigger, like, a long-term buff on you that's actually really good. But, like, a 1% chance, it kind of makes more sense when you're AoEing a lot. But they have a really poor set of rules for what those traits can be. And a lot of the time, the decision you make isn't exciting, and the benefit you get isn't exciting. It's just like a tiny little thing you do every time you level. Not a fun experience. I'd also say this. World of Warcraft doesn't have many skills. It doesn't have barely any, really, compared to how Guild Wars was doing things based on its card game design, right? Its MTG origins and inspirations. You really don't get to play that much. WoW has very few skills, and then it hides this fact by having you tier your skills up constantly. So it's like, oh, look, I have more skills. Look, I've got a tier 1 version of multi-shot, and here's a tier 2 version of multi-shot. It's the same thing. It's just doing a little bit of different damage. And otherwise completely unchanged. And WoW doesn't have a concept of elite skills either. Guild Wars 1 had more skills in general, but actually had the idea of elites, which were big, build-defining things. You can only put one on your bar, and were really fun to play with. Think about Guild Wars skill design and, you know, profession balance and stuff, and take elite skills out. The game gets a lot more boring. Well, that's what WoW is. There's no elite skills to play with. Very, very, very poorly handled. And I didn't think it was very good either. So one thing that obviously is very different about the two games, but ultimately I don't think matters that much, is in terms of buildcraft. In WoW, you can use any skill you ever learn at any point. You can open the skill book, the spell book, and just spam stuff, anything. And you can set up your UI to have tons of skills all over the screen. I think it makes the game look ugly, and WoW's UI is obviously rather poor. We'll talk about presentation a little later. While Guild Wars only limits you to 8, but I think that's pretty much just a preference thing. There are certainly a lot of people that got turned off of Guild Wars over the years because it only had the 8 skills and they didn't like that. But I think that's one of those things where when you get your hands on it and when you really think about the design and you really think about how that affects your loadouts and how you tackle missions and stuff, you realize it brings a lot to the table. I like the limited skill bar a lot. Let's talk about enemies. The combat from enemies in WoW is horrendous. WoW enemies basically just stand around and auto attack, and slowly at that. And they'll move a little bit faster than you. The experience of being low on health, trying to disengage from like a tiger or something as it's biting you, and then it will bite and you'll realize the server thinks you're like 30 meters back in another direction, you just randomly fall down dead. It is awful. The feedback that you get in WoW as you're being attacked is terrible too. You can hardly like really get a sense because your character doesn't flinch very well. It doesn't flash very well. Things can be attacking you with melee strikes even though they're super far off. So that's all a horrible side of the WoW combat, and the enemies are just completely boring. They do nothing. Meanwhile, the Guild Wars enemies are fantastic because they're using player skills. Like, I think of a Hydra, it's like, wow, that thing's going to cast Meteor Shower. If I think of the Char, I think of, the Char Stalkers using Ignite Arrows and various combos. Like, the enemies can teach you as a player combos that are worth using. And when you think about an enemy in Guild Wars casting a spirit, like a spirit of favorable winds, that can now actually augment your player skills, that's a really deep and amazing interaction that World of Warcraft is pathetic for. And it's not just in the open world, it's pretty much anywhere World of Warcraft is pathetic. You might sometimes get them doing a little bit more interesting thing, but wow. And then bosses as well. The first half of World of Warcraft leveling, all the bosses are pathetic in dungeons. They do basically nothing, but slowly they do get better. Slowly there is like, oh, now I shouldn't stand next to that guy. They start doing the idea of phases, and you can interact with the environment every now and then. It's just a very slow drip. I do think that by the end, World of Warcraft definitely has better boss fights. Guild Wars was always content to just have its skill system as it is and give its bosses, extra health and extra cast speed and stuff like that. And, you get the morale boost and whatnot at the end. But overall, I think the bosses are really bad as well. They do get better towards the end, though. That's another thing. Morale and death penalty for Guild Wars. Meanwhile, WoW's mechanics and punishments for death are really just there as time gates. Here's a point that I'm a bit loath to mention, but there's the whole multi-classing thing. I personally do not think that multiple professions was a great idea for Guild Wars 1 in the end. I think it caused a lot of headaches. I think it diluted a lot of stuff. I think it limited their class design. And I'm happy that ArenaNet identified that and changed that with the sequel, so we can't multi-class anymore. I think having multiple professions was not that great, personally. However, I do acknowledge that a ton of people love Guild Wars 1 for its multiple profession system. The fact that I can be an elementalist / mesmer or a monk / warrior. People loved this stuff. And World of Warcraft didn't have it. It had other features, obviously, and it had, like, gathering disciplines and stuff, but it did not have multi-classing, and it did not have that, again, beautiful trading card kind of thing of interacting skills from multiple classes on the same person at once. One of the only downsides I can really think of from Guild Wars combat that's very frustrating is the body blocking and the rubber banding. So lots of things had collision, and especially in early 2000s, which is when we're talking about this, you would rubber band a lot in Guild Wars 1, and you could randomly die, just as I explained for WoW in Guild Wars 1 also. So that was a bit of a problem with that game, and it's an unfortunate thing. But in general, wow, the Guild Wars combat kicks WoW's ass. The Guild Wars combat was so good. And I particularly adore that when a balance patch came out, it was like, oh, I get these new tools, but so do the enemies in various places. Very, very, very fun. This isn't even to mention the specific mechanical gameplay, which in general, you're in MMOs, the specific mechanics and reflexes and stuff like that are never really that important. But even there, I think Guild Wars wins out. You look at some of those old 55 HP monk farms or some of the runs, like the idea of being a runner. So combat, this section definitely goes to Guild Wars, and is a reason I still think it's a brilliant, worthwhile game to play. And the synergy presentation in Guild Wars 1 and how satisfyingly they affected their themes and presented them, it was all really good. And then there's PvP. World of Warcraft PvP, the balance is horrendous. It's almost ridiculous to use the two words together. That WoW combat is in any way balanced, it's insane. They have stuns and stuff that last forever. There's a certain type of stun in WoW that you can apply to someone. It breaks if they get attacked. But if you don't break them. They're just stuck in it. Like I've got a trap on my hunter that can freeze someone in place, and they will never be able to break out.
So for audio,
we can talk a bit about the music
as long
as
as no one
hits them.
Stuff like mind control,
as fun as that is and flavorful that is, in a
music
PvP context,
is
I've just lost control of my character. There you go, that's it.
And so if
I
guess
listen
it's
to
kind
of
of fun and
interesting
music,
I get very nostalgic, and it's hard to be objective.
But
what I will say,
I
found none of the WoW music
situation
even remotely like
WoW did this amazing thing with
playing
PvP
RPGs
as well, where it integrated
and
all
new
over
games
the
to come
world.
out and say, "Oh, that's a nice song."
And
we have basically never had
the
an experience where I thought that I was
but
listening
it's
to
really
a nice
dragged
track
down
in
by
WoW,
just
ever.
horrendous balance.
Meanwhile,
Blizzard
with
had
Guild
no
Wars,
idea what they were doing.
yes, I have nostalgia and bias there, but it is Jeremy Soule, who's a big name in gaming OSTs and was becoming an increasingly big name around now. You got to remember that right as these two games came out was around when Elder Scrolls Oblivion released, and Jeremy was scoring that and getting bigger and bigger. I think that was some real pull. My inclination is to give the music to Guild Wars. What I would say as well, WoW was composed by a team of people who I don't recognize any of their names, but maybe they're very big within Blizzard. And I would also note that the World of Warcraft soundtrack clocks in at double, maybe even a little bit more, the length of the Prophecy soundtrack. So if your discussion is that of quantity, I think it's fair to give WoW some serious chops here. They had more variant music, it seems, or for longer. But you have to remember with WoW as well that many of their soundtracks include stuff like the next Rammus update. But many of those updates don't exist for Guild Wars 1 because they moved on to Factions. And the Factions OST. The Factions OST is gorgeous, but again, I've decided not to discuss that stuff for this review. Another matter is on voice acting. I would say that for any general stint of gameplay you have in WoW, you're going to hear a lot more voice acting. Because Blizzard were really smart about where they put it. They put it on, like, interacting with NPCs. You speak to someone, he's got his dialogue and it's written there, but he'll also say something like, "Greetings," or "How's it going?" or something like that. Prophecies doesn't really do that, ever. So, and it doesn't really have voice lines coming from your characters. So it's more like grunts and just noises rather than actual voice acting. I will say, Prophecies does have voice acting, but only in campaign cutscenes. And they're nice, but once you've played the campaign once, you probably don't care about those cutscenes anymore. I already described how most people end up skipping a lot of them. And that's it, to be honest. You don't really get much. So I think WoW did much better with the voice acting. Like I say, they put them on emotes. Fantastic. Then you have the world of sound effects. I already mentioned that the combat sound effects are awful. But what about footsteps, environmental noises, ambient stuff like that? In general, I feel like WoW did that stuff better. But it might just be because World of Warcraft in general is so immersive and so ready to put the environment to the fore that you feel the weight of those environmental sounds just that bit extra. And Guild Wars wasn't so much about it. Guild Wars was really kind of all eggs in its basket for combat, and so the combat sounds are good, and it's all eggs into its basket about PvP, so the soundscape there's alright, but in terms of like exploration and stuff, WoW probably comes out on top, maybe. Then moving away from audio, looking at visuals, you've got rendering, you've got style. So yes, WoW rendered things a lot more soft, they were more rounded, they were more kiddie. You could say that that's in an attempt to pander to as broad a demo as possible, get as many people in. It's definitely more stylistic of the two games. I think WoW probably will age better than Guild Wars, and I don't think either game actually aged too poorly. I mean, they both aged, right? But when compared to one another, they're pretty much still going blow for blow. Guild Wars 1 actually has an early trailer that I already mentioned that looks like a spoof of WoW. It looks like the earliest moments for Guild Wars, they were like, yeah, let's make a game that looks just like WoW. And there's a story about how they hired someone to overhaul the aesthetic. For the time, Guild Wars 1, I say looked way better, was way more capable of things, and was gorgeous. And people generally regarded, to put it crudely, as the game with the better graphics. Nowadays, I think that there is a bit of push and pull there. They went more photorealistic, but does that really work when a lot of it's big open fields? Some of the so-called cities and towns you're at in Guild Wars 1 don't really feel like it. They just feel like big courtyards, and that sucks. Because WoW had the better engine, and it would cluster stuff together better, and you had that Y-axis, they could just make so many more intricate, amazing-looking places. That means a lot of the environments end up winning out, right? But so there you have it. For asset density, obviously Guild Wars 1 wasn't that bad. The feeling of exploring Fallen Ascalon and when you're actually out there on the adventures is really grim and dark and sad, and I think they accomplished it very well. As for optimization, I'm not sure which game ran better than the other. I actually have no clue. I can't speak to it too much. But I do remember that way back, I used to struggle to render water in Guild Wars 1. That was a real problem for my graphics card and my rig until way later when I got an upgrade. So, hey, who knows? Let's talk about animations as well. Particularly, this means like combat animations. I would say that WoW has bigger ones and more varied ones. A lot of the Guild Wars 1 stuff was very muted and very subtle. The game was very much about reacting to what your opponent's doing, and every animation is tied to a specific skill, like a specific action. But players were really reliant on the UI for that, you know. Am I interrupting that elite healing skill because I'm looking at their hands and the actual, you know, animation? No, I'm looking at the user interface. So they're not that flashy in Guild Wars 1. In fact, the actual physical looking difference, seeing a elementalist casting spells versus a hex necro casting spells, they're just standing there wobbling their arms around. The spells themselves can have different effects. Something like Meteor Shower looks very good. There's an equivalent in WoW. If you think about Hellfire in WoW, it's kind of like Guild Wars 1's Meteor Shower or Firestorms. There's a lot of skills that cross over. A lot of skill names cross over. But in general, I think WoW does win. I think it has the prettier looking combat. Unless you think visual noise is a problem. WoW has way, way, way more visual noise. It's kind of ugly and kind of crappy to see how things look a lot of the time in WoW. But most party-based games end up in that place. Guild Wars tried very hard to keep that away, and it had very spectatable sports and PvP. But overall, for as the game in general, I think I do prefer WoW for the animation side. And then you've got enemies. I think the games are actually very close on this. World of Warcraft has, first of all of its playable races that it can then spin variations on as enemies, whereas Guild Wars, you only play as humans, so ArenaNet can't do that so much. But in WoW, they don't just have you constantly fighting versions of the playable races, but they have pretty unique bosses in the dungeons. They have lots of rich fauna. For example, the first time I saw a Kodo was really exciting. That's quite a big, interesting creature, and WoW was always surprising me with stuff like that. Seeing the tech creatures at like Gnome Ragan, I liked those. Guild Wars managed to do a lot of fun things with its creatures too. You got the small things like dwarves, scales, devourers, and they even go quite far with the story for some of those, like with the devourers. You've got obviously humans that you fight sometimes, such as the White Mantle, but they go big as well. Oak Hearts, Flesh Abominations, the Titans, the Hydra, the Giant Worms. They were all Prophecy's enemies, and they were all around. Between the two for enemy presentation, I think it's probably about a tie. And as for the overall comparison of presentation between the two games, I think it's subjective enough that on this one I'll sit on the sidelines. Let's call them tied. Social elements. The next section I had meant to write about was that of social, and I wasn't sure if this was going to fully make it in the review because I touch on social sides of the game in many of the other sections, but I felt very compelled to do it as its own section because while playing World of Warcraft, the social sides of the game come up again and again and again. I actually think Blizzard were masters of this, like true masters. It's so easy to find yourself in a party or find yourself in a guild or have a community in World of Warcraft with the way that they had stuff set up. I mean, traditional MMOs and the predecessor MMOs had definitely paved the way, and Blizzard copied this. So let's figure out, first of all, Guild Wars, how often would you be socializing with people? Well, if you wanted while doing the campaigns and while doing standard questing or capturing boss skills, or if you got stuck, you would find players. Some of the campaign missions could genuinely be challenging, especially some of the later ones, and as soon as you were under any real challenge, you'd find yourself socializing with people, forming those groups. You did have a bit of a Trinity problem in Guild Wars 1. You wanted like minions or some kind of bruisery guy to take aggro. You did want traditional healers. You did have to wait for their mana to come back and all that kind of stuff, even if it wasn't through food and the economy in that game. So, you know, you could call those problems, but they are also moments where people end up using chat and typing to one another and enjoying. Guild Wars also, because its combat was very sophisticated, you ended up communicating a lot and pinging specific targets like, no, kill this monk first. The monk is healing the boss, so kill the monk. You had little moments like that very regularly, and I feel I could communicate about meaningful combat stuff in Guild Wars than I could in WoW. Other reasons that you might communicate in Guild Wars is obviously trading. People would trade dyes on the original dye system. People would trade any kind of rare materials as they craft items. If you were playing the Fissure of Woe in the Underworld, you'd be trading obsidian shards and ectoplasm. So there were economies. There were even economies for specific quest items, which I quite enjoy. People who would like run a quest, get an item, abandon, and then sell that item, run a quest, abandon, and do it again. I was interested to find that World of Warcraft did do that a little bit as well. I don't think as much as Guild Wars, but it did do a little bit of that, so that was kind of nice to see. And another one that's really interesting is the idea of running. So in Guild Wars 1, because of the map infrastructure and the loading screens, a single player could get a really fast, tanky build that can't really kill anything, but they would zigzag their way through the map, skipping all the enemies, and then when they hit the farpoint loading screen, the entire party would move with them. And you could do this to cheese low-level players or idle players into distant areas of the world. You could unlock outposts and teleportation locations for them that they never really earned, they never worked for. And you would pay a player for this service of running. Now, that service of running was huge in Prophecies. Really big. It was one of the most exciting things you could do, and it felt like a really authentic, brilliant part of the game. But no one was ever really sure how ArenaNet felt about it, and then, I think, poorly decided, when they did their later campaigns, they structured everything so that running wasn't so easy anymore. Running couldn't be done. But runs for campaign missions, tours of various regions to unlock all of the outposts, these were all big social things, and because they involved a lot of idle gameplay, there was lots of opportunity to talk, and I have many fond memories of these social situations. World of Warcraft, as far as I'm aware, has a couple of little areas where running like that happened at Classic, but it was nowhere near as ubiquitous as it was with Prophecies, and it was a fantastic part of the game that I really still look back fondly on. Other things that were interesting with social really start going in WoW's camp. WoW did so many cool things. The language filter with the Horde versus Alliance, where if you try to type to them, it comes out as gobbledygook. And it's quite a sophisticated cipher too. You can't easily figure it out. There are tools on the internet that will allow you to communicate in rough ways. But because you can't talk, it leads to you like emoting to people who are on the opposite team. And the idea that as you're wandering around, you have the open world PvP filtering in, that's not an element of Guild Wars 1, but it leads to all these amazing social situations. Just the simple, continuous open world from WoW, where you can see, like I say, someone on a flight path flying overhead on you on a griffin or something you might want to talk to. I remember being idle a fishing spot in WoW for a while, and when I came back to the game, I saw someone had been typing to me because they'd flown overhead and they saw that I was under attack or something at the time. These are all lovely little moments, emergent, sudden moments of finding people you didn't expect that Guild Wars doesn't have. Guild Wars, you know where you're going to find people in outposts, and you know where you're going to find people if they're in your party. That's it. There's nothing special or surprising to communicate. WoW was really good with having whole towns be hostile based on what region or area you're in. WoW was really good with the whole idea of loot stealing and partying up. You know, these are like griefing mechanics almost and wrinkles in player experiences, but they were great for the social sides of the game. They built in the needing and greeting system, which Guild Wars has nothing like, which is fantastic too. I really enjoyed playing with that, and the amount I've communicated with people over that. World of Warcraft is so idle and slow, so unbelievably excruciatingly slow and hands-off and easy, that you're free to type all the time. That wasn't so true in Guild Wars 1. There was quest sharing as a system in WoW. Like, just look at all these systems Blizzard added, and ArenaNet never added. Like, World of Warcraft is so much more of a game. If you have a quest, you can walk over to someone and you can try to share it to them so that they don't have to find the initial NPC, and then you can complete it together. What a lovely thing there. The trading system in WoW, you can enchant each other's items without actually fully trading. And just the idea that that system's in place in the first place, let alone that the UI supports an easy way of doing it, is brilliant. You've got skills that are social, like the Warlock portaling, like I say, like mind control, like I say, like how priests can spy on people as well, and they can see that they're being spied on. I've had some hilarious experiences at neutral zones, right? Like Booty Bay, where I'm like slash spitting on people with emotes, trying to get them to fight me so they get attacked by bruisers and bodyguards. What an amazing social experience. Just emoting at people because they wouldn't understand me in any other way because of the language cipher and on. They've got a gift wrapping system in there, so if you want to give someone an item but you don't want them to know what it is, you can actually wrap it up. The whole locking people into specific servers so they have specific communities means that you can identify who trades what, who farms what, where they're coming from on the global trading post. They have direct trading and the global trading post, which is kind of a nice balance, means that you still communicate with people, but you get that convenience there. They have that beautiful thing where if I craft an item, it says that I'm the guy that did it. And now that might get traded around for like months, and months later I might get a whisper from someone who says, hey, you made this thing, can you make me another one? Like, I get known as a smith by the community. Like, Guild Wars just doesn't even begin to broach these kinds of things. If you really wanted to live in a virtual online world, that's the game that Blizzard were making, and they let you do it. And the community and the social sides are a huge part of it. That's why World of Warcraft wins. That category, hands down, WoW is a better game. Player versus player. The next section was one of the bigger ones I had to work on, so I actually, unfortunately, do not have that many observations here. It was on PvP. So PvP is really deep, I think, and could easily be half an hour of discussion all on its own, because I think something quite funny happened with these two games, where Guild Wars was really going all about the PvP and made a lot of compromises and a lot of design decisions with its PvE to squeeze that PvP in and try and push everyone onto it. And yes, it did have very good PvP and very competitive PvP and fun PvP, deeper assessments of which I wish I could now give you, but won't. But then it kind of muddied the waters. It muddied the waters by adding like PvE endgame. And then when it did new campaigns, it kind of messed up and leaned even more on PvE. And then it leaned even more as time went over. And I think ArenaNet kind of didn't get the balance they wanted in the end. And amazingly, and really sadly, actually, I think, over with Blizzard, they kind of just slapped PvP into a game that had no good balance for it. But they had the open world PvP with the Alliance versus Horde, and they weren't scared to do that. And then later, yes, they started doing these other changes with this honor system that I have not experienced. And it strikes me that PvP is kind of a more present, interesting experience in WoW than in Guild Wars. What a crying shame that is. Now, when I first played Guild Wars 1, the thing I did was PvP. Like, I would go to each little new arena around the world, and I would just PvP, 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 and then I would go to the next one and PvP, PvP, PvP. But after a short while, they did a patch where they deleted most of those arenas, and you can't kind of do that experience anymore. And they kind of just relegated it further and further away. While in WoW, I'm always on the lookout. Like, I might be about to get attacked. I'm questing in a zone where someone might jump me while I'm taking this quest text. And there's a lot of things about WoW that sound frustrating on paper. But if you don't have the experience too regularly, they're actually really fun. And as awful as the balance is, I feel like PvP is a bigger pressure in WoW and ended up being like this great thing. This isn't even an assessment of Battlegrounds, which again I haven't played. I don't even know if it's in WoW Classic at the moment. But what a fascinating thing to think about. I think if I'd completed this review, I would have given you guys a deeper assessment about GVG and how great or how poor it was, about the teams, about the tournaments that were hosted at that time. A lot of the news for those tournaments and the winners and the announcements and stuff is still on the original Guild Wars website. I don't know whether they had automated tournaments in that time. I don't know at what point spectator mode came in. I think it was all there, though. I think for a lot of people, when they think of, oh, the big, amazing LANs that used to get hosted for Guild Wars, like in Germany, and wish that the sequel had, a lot of them are actually thinking about one of the factions tournaments, not actually prophecy stuff. So I would have done a bit more homework about that to really figure out. But my instinct on this, actually, is I would have Guild Wars 1 win this category, but I think it's close. I think it's really close, and that's not good. Guild Wars was gunning the PvP angle so hard, and yet didn't even that magnificently come out ahead. But maybe that's my ignorance, as I wasn't a competitive PvP player during those days, seeping through, while a lot of the WoW PvP elements are available and visible even to those quite casual players, because, you know, the experience is often around. Maybe there were some big missteps with WoW's PvP elements as well. This honor system coming in particular, I've heard, has been a bit of a mess. But I can't really say for sure. So there you have it. That's the PvP section. An important one. Features. I wanted to do something of a section that articulated and listed out what features each game has, because that's obviously a big part of the full experience, the sum of all the smaller features that they've included. And what will really strike you here is just how empty Guild Wars is compared to WoW. It would have just been so hard for ArenaNet to get so many different things in when they had so much smaller of a budget and so fewer people working on the game, that a lot of this is to be expected. And you can basically make the argument that as long as Guild Wars gets its core stuff really good, which I would say it did, maybe a lot of this doesn't matter. But the only big feature that I have listed out on this tentative list, which would have been fleshed out more, that Guild Wars has and WoW didn't, was the die system, actually. I was interested to realize that Guild Wars 1 had a much better die system than WoW did. With Guild Wars obviously allowing you to mix dyes into different shades, color individual bits of armor, be able to dye all your weapons as well in Guild Wars 1. And WoW was just seriously lacking. But then if you were just to list out some basic facts about the games, like what did what, you'll see that Guild Wars is lacking a ton of stuff. World of Warcraft had multiple races to play. Guild Wars 1 didn't. I do think, again, that the idea of having only one background, one race to play, humans, and everyone starts together and you can really focus on those early things being high quality and have that kind of linear experience, was great for Guild Wars. WoW feels really messy a lot of the times. Like, oh, am I going to a higher level zone now? Oh, no, this is just some noob stuff because apparently one of the races started here. But I've got no real direction. I think there's something immersive about the idea that there are both low-level and high-level players all over the world, because all the starting places are all over the world as well. But World of Warcraft definitely did struggle to have a uniform line of quality for all of its starting stuff. I might have picked one of the worst with the Tauren, but you go to play some of these other things, it's like, wow, these starting areas are really intricate and really lovely looking. But nonetheless, you can't escape the fact you've got loads of different races to play in WoW, and it feels good. And some classes are actually locked to some races. You know, just another one of the interesting sides of their profession design there, where they had those little tweaks in. And then there's different mounts based on the different races, and there's going to be different opening quests and stuff. So it's really nice. There's fishing as a feature. Guild Wars 1 did not have, but WoW has, and it's another idle thing, another social thing that you can do. There's gathering in general. You know, in WoW, you've got all these different things that you can gather and level, and different ways you can augment the minimap to look at them, and then you can choose to sell them straight up, or you can craft them. None of that in Guild Wars 1. It's completely empty of any of those extra layers. There are no mounts, we just mentioned, in Guild Wars 1. You can argue there's no need for mounts. I certainly would. In later Guild Wars installments, they did experiment with mount-based gameplay and transformations and stuff. But no, there's no mounts, and I think for a lot of people, just that style of having a mount was important, and they never got it in Guild Wars 1. Guild Wars 1 even lacks a lot of small things. With its quests, as few as there were, they never had like an idea of like an epic quest. A quest that's more difficult and has a bigger reward, something more specific to look at. But WoW's got loads of those. WoW was already doing it, and it took Guild Wars 1 a few years until Nightfall to start copying it. Again, Nightfall was out before the Drums of War, so if we did that comparison, then it definitely looks a lot more even, but we won't. And then, of course, the big end game feature, raids. There's no raiding. And a laundry list of other things. This section here of the review would really just articulate, wow, Guild Wars was very focused in its ambition at what it did. It did not have this plethora, this cornucopia of other stuff going on. And going back to the original CORPG versus MMO discussion, this you might actually say is one of those things where it's like, okay, this is why Guild Wars doesn't feel like an MMO sometimes, because it just didn't have all that extra stuff. And I hope that in my review here, I've taught you why things ended up that way. Miscellaneous. The final section before the conclusion, I wanted to talk about some miscellaneous and stray thoughts of mine. Particularly, I have a section here on interface, which now I'm looking at probably would have gone better in presentation. But I think that interfaces were pretty interesting to compare. Guild Wars 1 has a very specific idea of an interface. It didn't allow add-ons and so on. So what you see is what you get. Now, that you could reskin it with text mod, and the devs kind of stood by and let people do that. And sometimes with text mod, people would actually retext the whole game world. Like there's a Christmas version of text mod that added snow everywhere and stuff like that. And in general, the interface is what it is, but they still gave you good amounts of freedom. You could resize any element you like. You could move it. You just couldn't transfigure stuff. You could toggle pretty much any element of the UI you want on. And if we're talking add-on-less WoW, there's no add-ons to play with. I guess the truth is that Guild Wars had a better interface and a more customizable one. But as soon as you add add-ons, WoW obviously blows out of the water. I actually spent a little bit of time playing WoW Classic with a Guild Wars 2 UI skin. How funny is that? You could do stuff like that with WoW. So the fact they added add-ons just means there's so much going on. Especially now with the relaunch, there's obviously a load of known add-ons, and there's all these years of community efforts and developments that are instantly available at release. I can't really know if we're in the summer of 2005 what it felt like and how many add-ons there were for WoW. But the UI can definitely be customized in a lot of ways. I would say that the default tendency of World of Warcraft to have a user interface that is cluttered with skill icons and ridiculous like damage floaters everywhere and massive parties, has way too much information on screen and looks ridiculous and terrible. But then it can be tweaked, so hey. Guild Wars had a big problem with its UI and immersion. As always, immersion was a big step down for Guild Wars, but to do with its minimap. So in World of Warcraft, yes, there are skills that can put enemy icons on the minimap and stuff, but you don't spend too long looking at the minimap. Not really. Your eyes are usually focused on the environment and what's going on around you. Meanwhile, in Guild Wars, and a few RPGs can get like this, it's kind of a game where it doesn't really matter how beautiful it is a lot of the time. You're just staring at the minimap. So, oh, I definitely don't want to get that extra patrol. I'm staring at the minimap and I'm watching to see my aggro radius. I'm trying to keep enemies out of earshot because the second they're in earshot, they're going to attack me. So I'm just focused all the time. I'm convinced if you watched an experienced Guild Wars 1 player with an eye tracker on, you would see they're just always staring at their compass. They're always staring at the minimap. And it's because of the red dots on there. And that was a real problem and a real interface aspect that WoW kind of got away from. I would say WoW had other weird things. It was very laggy. Like, I've got a very good system, and we're many years after the original launch of Classic. So why is my entire game locking up and freezing when I open my system panel? My system options, sorry. I know that that's not really a point I'd like to linger on in any review because it's a very specific thing to me. But it does feel weird how clunky the WoW user interface could sometimes be. And I also wanted to talk a bit about the game's world maps. I love the Guild Wars 1 world map. It works so well. You can clearly see where you are. You can zoom in and out at whatever scale you like. The World of Warcraft world map is really weird and clunky and not very artistic. Didn't enjoy it too much. I do quite like how on the world map for World of Warcraft, you could mouse over certain regions that are unplayable, but they'd still light up as though, oh, you'll be able to go here soon. And indeed, later expansions and stuff allowed you to. That was some nice hinting. But in general, I don't like the World of Warcraft world map compared to the Guild Wars one. There's the idea of character creators, which we could have done a section on. In general, I think the Guild Wars 1 character creator is a little bit better than the WoW one, but they're both very rudimentary. It's kind of hard to unpack the idea of multiple races from the character creator itself, but, you know, how many faces can I have? What different sliders can I use to manipulate the way my character looks? How can I customize my armor and stuff? I tend to feel like you can make some really nice looking characters in Guild Wars, but then there's only humans, so maybe that's natural that ArenaNet could put more effort in than Blizzard could. I actually found the Blizzard World of Warcraft character creator ridiculously underwhelming, and I find myself wondering if contemporary WoW has actually changed that. I would hope it has. Mini pets are an interesting feature. World of Warcraft had minis from the start. I don't know whether they had, I mean, they must have taken it from another MMO. But yeah, you can buy minis, you can find minis, you can trade minis. They're all over. Guild Wars 1 only did minis initially as birthday gifts. You had to get a whole year into the game. You needed a character that was 12 months old. If you deleted the character or lost it anyway, that was it. It was over. And then you got one present, and it was a RNG chance when you opened the present to get a cool mini out of it. And there were specific tiers of rarity. There were common minis that most people got. Some people, when they got their first present, they got really lucky. They got like an uncommon mini. There were rare ones, and then there were super like amazingly rare like unique ones. That was kind of crazy. I loved that system, and minis felt very special in Guild Wars 1 for a time. That's kind of a subjective personal value judgment there, but I do think it's interesting to see how the two games did minis very different. In subsequent years, Guild Wars ended up doing minis just like WoW, really. You could get them from other places too. But the idea of the birthday gift system, I liked. That does mean, though, that 6 months after launch, if you were deciding play WoW or play Guild Wars, only one game had minis, you know? It took ArenaNet a long time to get that system actually in place and for players to actually start getting awarded with them. The minis themselves as well, I think are pretty much par for par with one another. I think in both games they make sound effects and they're both basically different versions of enemies and things that you see around in the world. Not too bad. Then we can talk about festivals. Which games had which festivals? How did they handle festivals? There's so much to go into here because ArenaNet went really mental with the festivals. The first festival for Prophecies was Halloween, the first ever of their franchise. And ArenaNet went really, really heavy with the decorations. They planted them all over the place. You do have an equivalent in WoW. I believe it's called the Harvest Festival. You've got the Fire Festival in WoW. There's Brewfest. There's like lots of little festivals in WoW. There's also like weekly events sometimes and like specific competitions, I think, for like fishing and stuff, as far as I'm aware, that give you unique items that aren't mainstream festivals. They're just like smaller things going on. There's actually a huge list of them in WoW. Then none of them are as detailed or as intricate or add as many decorations. Like if you look at the Guild Wars festival, they decorated not just one map, but like loads of them. They decorated outside tombs, and they decorated Joknar's Forge, and they decorate Lion's Arch. And things were a little bit thinner on the ground for WoW, but they did so many more that most of the year there's usually stuff going on. So that's an interesting difference between the games. My instinct is that actually that WoW did it better, just because there's so much more variety. I believe WoW had bosses dropping hats as well, maybe. But largely they were pretty similar, you know. It was like get some new cosmetics and see how that goes. Some other little things between the two games. In both games, people would roll for loot, right? In Guild Wars, you often played rock, paper, scissors. In WoW, you can obviously roll and you would see it print and people roll to decide what treasure chest they open. You actually roll and do those social things in WoW way more than in Guild Wars, so it probably wins out there. In Guild Wars, when you die, you can actually spectate your allies. And you can see what skills they're using, and you can actually have some fun. In WoW, if you die in the middle of a run, you're just kind of sitting there, and you're a ghost, right? And you got the whole ghost mechanic and graveyard runs, so you can't really do that. I really liked the spectating system in Guild Wars. WoW didn't have it, so I thought that was a nice little thing that ArenaNet managed to get in. In Guild Wars as well, they had a much more sophisticated mini-map for pinging and drawing instructions and giving people lines and targeting enemies and hotkeys to take the target. That was all really good. And sure, a lot of people spent their time drawing penises on the mini-map or whatever and messing around, but they were brilliant communication features that WoW didn't have, so they actually won out on that. At launch, neither game had an LFG system. LFG, I mentioned at the start of this review that World of Warcraft eventually undermined its opening approach. And LFG was a big moment for that for WoW. It caused a lot of issues with people. Guild Wars did have an LFG feature eventually, but it was more of like a party assist thing. It didn't teleport you around the world. It didn't do anything phenomenally different. It was just a convenience feature. So overall, I enjoyed the Guild Wars LFG, but neither game had them at this point. And then, of course, there is the distinction between having an auction house in the game versus not having an auction house. It was pure direct trading in Guild Wars. And with the district system, that could sometimes be a bit frustrating, because you can't just go to a town and see everyone that's trading in that town. You could only see the people who were there in that version of that town, and then you'd have to swap districts to figure out if there was someone selling somewhere else. I found, though, that this didn't really matter too much, and third-party websites and forums and things kind of approximated auction houses and stuff like that for Guild Wars, so not a big deal. And that's another thing as well. I don't know whether Blizzard were actually hosting their own forums. That was some research I wanted to do. Guild Wars wasn't hosting its own forums. It was all fan sites. And there was a real sense of like fan camaraderie in those days that maybe was different on the Blizzard side, because they were just one game out of many coming from Blizzard and so on. So yeah, there were a few like minor features and minor little points that I wanted to go into for there. conclusion. So this would have been the final moment of the review, the conclusion, where we look at everything we did so far and see which categories were won by which game, and then maybe say which one was the better game at long last. And here is what I think. I think genuinely World of Warcraft is the better game. I think it's the bigger game. I think it's the more feature-rich game. I think some of the design in WoW is really intelligent, sneakily intelligent. And while it's true that even in 2005, people were getting bored of this like standard fare, contemporary kind of MMO experience, they were looking for something different. They still had a lot to offer. And obviously they had just taken what was good about other MMOs before then and really perfected the formula, pairing it with a great franchise, and with all their manpower and their big budget, they managed to create what is inarguably an excellent MMO. And I can see why it became so successful. The idea that people wanted a different form of MMO is just a Guild Wars 2 thing, and ArenaNet only started doing it with Guild Wars 2 is wrong. Guild Wars 1 was made to go against the grain, and in some ways definitely did. And it went really hard against the grain in a lot of things. But I think their fundamental idea of a PvE flow into a PvP experience, and how they never really stuck with their guns, kind of hamstrung them in a way, and they didn't quite fully realize their vision. And then they really complicated it with their extra campaigns and their new boxes that started coming out when they started really throwing the balance off of the PvP. And they made it really hard for their balanced team and kind of shot all of that in the foot until eventually they decided that they needed to go for a sequel. So I do think Guild Wars is a great game. And in terms of like standing the test of time, I think Guild Wars will always be a great game. That whole thing about how there's no real solo experience unless you do it with AI, it does mean something. The fact that we have a big campaign we can play is... It doesn't matter how big the population will ever get with Guild Wars 1 anymore. It could be nobody playing it. But 10 years from now, I can log in and I can do the campaign. I can go through... I can treat it like a single-player RPG. If World of Warcraft ever got to that level, and I don't know whether it will or when it will, when no one was playing it, it would be impossible. You get no value out of World of Warcraft Classic if no one else was around. It's reliant on its community, and it's reliant on people being excited about it. There's just nothing interesting going on with the game. But at least Guild Wars has that like through line. It has that side to it. So I do think it will always be a good game. I do think that it did combat extremely well. In review, if there's any one section, any one thing that really surprised me when doing this, when sitting down and doing this comparison, is that Guild Wars was like the try-hard combat game. I never realized, I'd never thought of it this way, but its combat, its buildcraft, its profession design is light years ahead of anything WoW had ever done. It was so much smarter, so much better made. It's incredible how shallow and boring a lot of those RPG and like combat-related experiences are for me in WoW versus how they are in Guild Wars. And Guild Wars definitely had its fair share of things that it did well. If convenience is the be-all and end-all for you, if you don't care about immersion at all, Guild Wars is what it's all about. If you don't mind that you can really sort of feel you're playing software and you're not in a game, Guild Wars is there for you. If PvP is what you really wanted, a competitive, structured PvP, Guild Wars was there for those players. But all of the things that Guild Wars was, I think was a little bit more fringe. And so when I look at the success and the trajectories of both franchises, and Guild Wars 1 was very successful, I want to be clear. It just didn't like have the legs that WoW did. I think it's not surprising. It's not surprising how things went. What I'm mostly sad about, and this is something the review didn't look at very much, is ArenaNet's success with their future campaigns. I'm really sad to see, if you look at like Google Trends and stuff, how much less interest there was in Guild Wars factions to Prophecies. And then when Factions came out and they did all that work, in the same year, they did another one, Nightfall. And these were full new campaigns with all their stories and all these improvements. And then Nightfall sold even worse. I feel so bad for ArenaNet at that period. At that period where all three of those were out and Blizzard was only just getting to the drums of war. Well, what I did for this review is looked through patch note history, like literally just scrolling through how often did patches come out, how big were the patches. And ArenaNet were working their asses off. Blizzard looks so incredibly lazy and inept and slow with even the most remote little changes. But they built this like game that would sustain an audience anyway, just because of how aggressively like steady it was, and the slow drip at which you get new levels, and how difficult it would be to organize a 40-man raid for people. So people just never hit that end. ArenaNet were working overtime, and it's crazy for me to think if we had done Drums of War versus all 3 first campaigns, it's unbelievable to realize that ArenaNet was selling less and less and less. Meanwhile, Blizzard's raking in all this subscription fee money for doing basically nothing. Was sickening to look at, really, really. So there you have it. WoW, I think, is the better game. I think it's definitely the winner. I think it has more stuff, it had a bigger budget, it had more going on with it. And I think Blizzard showed a real deep intelligence and understanding that even though on the surface something looks fiddly and annoying, there's something really deep and exciting that can come out of it. You know, if you're standing around waiting for ages for a boss to spawn, that sounds horrendous, but you get in the game and you play it and you realize you're like developing this connection with the town you're in and the people that you were standing next to, and you're emoting at them and you're having fun, and it's a pleasant experience even though you don't feel like you're doing much. And you move super slow, but nonetheless you start to really get a good sense of what Azeroth is like, and you're enjoying being there. I think Blizzard were really shrewd, more shrewd than ArenaNet were. And I think they got a lot of their success from that in the end. What I will also say, though, in ArenaNet's favor, is ArenaNet understood much better where gaming was going. They knew people would get tired of this World of Warcraft formula. They knew that something better was out there, that there was a way to break the wheel. A lot of what Guild Wars 1 ended up doing, and many studios ended up doing, kind of got rolled into WoW, and they became a lot more like how Guild Wars was set up. I genuinely don't think it's ridiculous to say that Guild Wars 1 was ahead of its time. It jumped the gun. It thought there were more burned out MMO nerds than there actually were at the time. And it doesn't surprise me that a few years later, they sold the same story when marketing their sequel. It's amazing, but if you look back at Guild Wars 1 Prophecy's articles and interviews and press, and you read quotes, you can legitimately be confused as to knowing whether it's press for Guild Wars 1 or press for Guild Wars 2, because ArenaNet was selling the same story both times. I think they were just ahead of the time in Guild Wars 1. The real story here might be that long-term, Blizzard has been smarter about copying the best from Guild Wars than Guild Wars has been from copying the best of WoW. So those are my thoughts. It's been a thoroughly wonderful experience. Thank you very much for watching this epic review. Looking forward to some epic walls of text down in the comments, and I'll endeavor to do some other stuff like this too. For any of you guys who want to see more videos like that, keep an eye out on the channel. Cheers, guys. I'll see you next time.